Section 1. The nuclear power plant and the poison in the water. There is a building at the edge of Springfield that every resident can see from almost anywhere in town. Two enormous cooling towers, cracked along the sides, bleeding steam into the sky at all hours. A facility that employs a significant portion of the town's working population, that powers every light in every home on every street, and that has been, for the entirety of the show's existence, one of the most dangerous industrial sites ever depicted in the history of fiction, the Springfield nuclear power plant. And the theory that surrounds it is not really a theory at all. It is a diagnosis. Start with what the show has actually told us, stated plainly, in canonical episodes that aired without any suggestion of metaphor. The plant is a 2-unit pressurized water reactor owned and operated by Charles Montgomery Burns. It is the sole source of electricity for the entire town, and when a surprise safety inspection was conducted, the inspectors found 342 separate violations. Not one or two, not a handful of minor infractions. 342 documented problems, each one representing something that should have been fixed, reported, and remediated before it had a chance to affect the surrounding population. The estimated cost of bringing the plant up to code was $56 million. Burns refused to spend it. He is a billionaire many times over. The money was available. He simply decided that fixing the violations was less desirable than maintaining them, because fixing them would require acknowledging that they existed, and acknowledging they existed would mean someone might start asking about what those violations had already done to the people living nearby. So the violations stayed. The cooling towers stayed cracked. The waste kept leaking, and the town kept drinking. The violations themselves are worth sitting with, because the show does not hide them. Radioactive waste being dumped directly into bodies of water. Radioactive waste being disposed of on a children's playground. Plutonium being used as a paperweight on someone's desk, just sitting there, accessible, glowing faintly. Cracked cooling towers patched with chewing gum. Luminous rats running through the utility corridors of an active reactor facility, their fur lit from within by whatever they had absorbed in the walls. And then there is the detail the show drops once and never revisits. Human skeletons in the basement, not animal bones, not ambiguous remains. Human skeletons, down in the lower levels of a working nuclear facility, and nobody ever explains who those people were, how they ended up there, or why the safety inspector who found them apparently did not think this warranted any further investigation. The show shows you the bones and moves on, and the safety inspector who was supposed to prevent all of this, the man whose literal job it is to stand between Springfield and radioactive disaster, is Homer Simpson. Homer, who the show's own creator has stated possesses an IQ of 55. Homer, who was discovered in one episode to have had a crayon lodged in his brain since childhood, physically reducing his cognitive function. Homer, who has been documented falling asleep at his workstation during active meltdown warnings, who has eaten donuts during emergency protocols, who once threw a donut into the reactor core to see if it would grow bigger. That is the person Springfield has trusted with its nuclear safety for over 3 decades. And that particular arrangement is not an accident. We will come back to that. But before we get to Burns and his intentions, let us follow the contamination outward, the way radiation actually moves, through water and air and soil, into living things, into the food chain, into the bodies of the people who live downstream and downwind and who have been doing so their entire lives. The first visible sign appears in Season 2. A fisherman pulls a 3-eyed fish out of a river near the power plant. The fish is named Blinky, and for a brief moment, Blinky becomes national news within the show. A gubernatorial candidate uses the fish as a campaign centerpiece, a symbol of what Burns has been doing to the environment. Burns is forced to eat the fish on live television to prove it is harmless. The town watches. Burns chews. The town shrugs. The cameras move on. Nobody tests the water. Nobody organizes a follow-up study. Nobody asks the most obvious question a person could ask, which is, if the fish have 3 eyes, what is happening to the people who drink from the same water source? That question does not get asked, but the answer has been sitting in the show since Season 8. In the episode called The Springfield Files, Homer sees a figure in the woods near Springfield, a glowing, alien-shaped being stumbling through the trees in a dazed, luminous state. The entire town responds with the kind of panic that Springfield reserves for genuine crises. FBI agents are called in. The town gathers. The mystery builds for an entire episode until the reveal. And when it comes, it is not an alien. It is Mr. Burns. Burns has been undergoing a weekly medical treatment so intensive, so saturated with chemicals and radiation therapy, that his body emits a visible green glow for hours afterward. The treatment keeps him alive for exactly 7 more days. Without it, he dies. And after each session, he wanders out of the facility in a euphoric, dazed state, stumbling through the forest like something from another world. He glows in the dark. Literally, his body emits visible light, and the people of Springfield see this glowing figure in the forest, and their immediate instinct is that it must be an extraterrestrial visitor. Not the nuclear power plant that has been dominating their skyline for their entire lives, not the radiation, an alien from space. That gap between the obvious explanation and the one Springfield chooses is the heart of everything. Now we come to the Simpsons movie, which moves the contamination theory out of the realm of speculation and into something the show itself treats as documented fact. Springfield's environmental contamination reaches a point so catastrophic that the Environmental Protection Agency, a real federal regulatory body operating within the show's universe, determines that the town must be physically sealed under a massive glass dome to prevent its pollution from spreading to the rest of the country. Think about what that means. The United States government looked at Springfield and concluded that the entire town was so toxic, so thoroughly contaminated, so dangerous to the surrounding region, that the only viable solution was physical containment. Not remediation, not cleanup. Containment. Springfield was classified as an environmental hazard by federal authorities, and every person living inside it, every resident who had been drinking that water and breathing that air, and living in the shadow of those cracked cooling towers, was sealed inside the dome when it went up. The contamination was so advanced, so complete, that the government did not try to fix it. They just put a lid on it. And now look at the residents themselves. Look at them as if you were seeing them for the first time, from outside, the way a visitor from a town with clean water and intact infrastructure would see them. Homer Simpson has a massive overbite, bulging eyes, 4 fingers on each hand, a skull shape that does not correspond to any normal human anatomy, and an IQ that qualifies as a clinical cognitive disability. His body can absorb punishment that would kill an unprotected person multiple times over. He has been shot. He has been electrocuted. He has fallen off cliffs, been hit by cars, survived explosions at close range, and walked away from every single one of them. His healing rate is remarkable even within the logic of the show. His pain tolerance is not human by any conventional measure. And he has worked inside that nuclear facility in direct proximity to an active reactor core for the entirety of his adult life. Marge Simpson has the same bulging eyes, the same 4 fingers and hair that defies the laws of physics, growing straight upward in a tower she has maintained in the exact same shape for 36 years without ever explaining how. Marge was briefly employed at the Springfield nuclear power plant herself. She was exposed to the same facility, the same conditions, the same leaking radiation. And her children, all 3 of them, were born after both parents had already been living in Springfield's contaminated environment for years. Bart and Lisa and Maggie, all born in Springfield, all raised in Springfield, all drinking the same water, breathing the same air, living every day of their lives under the shadow of those cooling towers. And every one of them displays physical characteristics that do not appear in normal human populations. The spiky hair that holds its shape without any product, the overbites, the bulging eyes, the yellow skin that covers every single resident of this town, and no one who arrives from outside it. That last detail is the one that makes the theory click into a different kind of shape. When celebrity guests appear in Springfield, when characters arrive from outside the town, they look different. Not slightly different in the way you might expect from animation-style variation. Fundamentally different. Their proportions are more natural. Their eyes sit more normally in their faces. Their features more closely resemble actual human anatomy. The show draws outsiders with measurably more realistic proportions than it draws Springfield residents. Everyone accepts this as a stylistic quirk, as just the way The Simpsons looks. But that explanation stops working once you notice the pattern. Within the logic of the show's own universe, there is a visible, observable difference between people who live inside Springfield and people who come from outside it. The people inside the contamination zone have characteristics that deviate from normal human appearance in specific, consistent ways. The people outside it look comparatively normal. Even the animals are caught in this. Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, has the same bulging eyes as his owners, the same proportions that deviate from real canine anatomy. Blinky the fish has 3 eyes. Springfield's wildlife is demonstrably mutated by the power plant's runoff. The show does not hide this. It shows you a 3-eyed fish and tells you directly that this is what the radiation is doing to living organisms. And then it asks you to believe that the exact same radiation has had zero effect on the humans living in the same environment, drinking the same water, eating the same food grown in the same soil. That is not a belief the evidence supports. Burns knows this. The show makes his knowledge explicit across multiple episodes. Burns funds private medical research. He maintains personal physicians. He undergoes weekly treatments that keep him alive through what amounts to chronic radiation poisoning. Burns understands radiation better than anyone in Springfield because he is personally dependent on managing its effects in his own body. He has resources, infrastructure, and an entire pharmaceutical operation capable of synthesizing experimental treatments. He knows what radiation does to biological systems because radiation is currently the thing keeping him alive. And he knows what his plant is doing to Springfield because, on some level, Springfield is functioning as his laboratory. Homer's continued employment, there is not negligence. It is not Burns being forgetful. It is a strategic decision, and the show provides the evidence for this in one specific detail. When a group of German investors briefly purchased the power plant, the first thing they did was fire Homer. The second thing they did was assess the cost of bringing the facility up to code. The estimate nearly bankrupted them on the spot. They sold the plant back to Burns almost immediately, and Burns rehired Homer within days of regaining ownership. A competent safety inspector would shut that plant down within a week. Homer ensures the violations continue. The radiation keeps leaking. The water stays contaminated. And Burns maintains his monopoly over Springfield's power supply, its economy, and by extension, its entire population. A population that has been drinking contaminated water long enough that critical thinking has become difficult. Not impossible, just difficult enough. The crayon in the brain episode, from season 12, adds a layer to this that most people treat as a comedy premise and then set aside. Homer has the crayon removed, and his IQ surges to genius level. He becomes articulate, perceptive, capable of understanding the world around him with a clarity he has never experienced before, and it makes him miserable. He sees Springfield for what it is. He sees his job for what it is. He sees the entire architecture of his life with sudden, horrible precision, and it is unbearable. So he has the crayon put back in, he chooses the fog. But the question the show never seriously engages with is how a crayon got lodged in a child's brain in the first place without anyone noticing. Homer went through his entire childhood, his adolescence, his adult life, visiting doctors in Springfield, receiving checkups from Springfield medical professionals, and not one of them found a foreign object inside his skull. Either every doctor in Springfield is incompetent beyond any realistic explanation, or someone knew it was there and made a decision to leave it. If Burns's influence extends into Springfield's healthcare infrastructure, if the town's medical establishment has been quietly managing the visible symptoms of contamination rather than treating their causes, then Homer's crayon is not just a comedy premise. It is the show using something absurd to tell you something it cannot say in a straightforward way. The people of Springfield have something wrong with their brains, something that keeps them compliant and incurious and incapable of looking up at those cooling towers and asking the most obvious question available to them. The radiation theory does not explain one mystery about The Simpsons. It explains all of them. Why the characters do not age, their mutated biology has been altered at the cellular level. Why the town resets after catastrophic events. The population's memory function has been compromised by chronic neurological damage. Why Homer survives injuries that should kill him. His body has adapted to radiation in ways that make him extraordinarily durable even as they erode his cognition. Why Burns stays alive through treatments that would kill a normal person. He has been managing his own radiation exposure for over a century with resources no one else in town has access to. Springfield is not a quirky animated town, it is a contamination zone. The residents are not eccentric, they are symptomatic. The nuclear power plant that dominates their skyline, powers their homes, employs their neighbors, and poisons their water is not a background element of the setting. It is the cause of everything. Every yellow face, every bulging eye, every impossible recovery, every forgotten disaster, every reset, every unexplained impossibility. It all traces back to the same cracked cooling tower, leaking the same invisible poison into the same water supply, feeding the same damaged brains that cannot figure out why their fish have 3 eyes and their children were born with 4 fingers. The Springfield nuclear power plant is not just part of the show. It is the engine the show runs on. And nobody in Springfield will ever understand that because the plant already made certain they couldn't. If you are watching this late at night, drop a comment letting us know where you are and what time it is where you're from. And if you want more of this, subscribe. There is so much more ahead. Section 2. Homer's Coma and the Dream That Never Ended. On the 1st of April, 1993, a specific episode of The Simpsons aired. Season 4, Episode 18. The title was So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. The premise was simple. Bart plays a series of escalating April Fool's pranks on Homer, each one more disruptive than the last, until the prank goes wrong enough to send Homer to the hospital. While Homer is lying in his bed recovering, he notices a vending machine across the room. He reaches for it, trying to retrieve a candy bar. The machine tips over and crushes him, and Homer Simpson enters a coma. A real, clinical coma. Not a cutaway, not a dream sequence. The show depicts Homer flatlining and losing consciousness in a way that is treated within the episode as genuinely serious. The episode ends with Homer seemingly waking up. Bart confesses at the bedside that the whole thing was his fault. Homer springs awake and immediately begins strangling his son, and the family laughs. Everything goes back to normal. The show tells you Homer woke up, but the episode also tells you, in its final moments, that Homer permanently lost 5% of his brain function during the coma. 5% gone, destroyed, never recoverable. And Homer's response to learning he has sustained permanent brain damage is to laugh, even though he says out loud that he does not understand why he is laughing. The family finds this charming. Nobody registers it as alarming. The episode ends and the show continues for 32 more years as if this detail was a footnote, unless it was not a footnote. Unless it was the entire story. Unless Homer never woke up at all. This is the Homer coma theory, and it is the most persistently debated, most internally consistent, most emotionally resonant fan theory in the entire history of The Simpsons. The core idea, originally developed and posted to a Simpsons discussion forum under the username HardTopicAname, is simple. Homer did not recover from his coma in April 1993. Every episode that has aired since that date, every storyline, every character development, every celebrity guest appearance, every impossible and increasingly surreal event is a dream being generated by the mind of a man lying in a hospital bed in Springfield General, slowly losing brain function while his family waits beside him for something that may never happen. The evidence for this theory is not a single clever observation. It is a pattern that runs through the entire architecture of the show, and once you see it, it does not go away. Start with the most discussed piece of evidence, the tonal shift. Before the coma episode, The Simpsons was a different kind of show. Not realistic in any strict sense, it was always a cartoon, always comedic, always exaggerated, but the storylines were grounded in recognizable human experience. Homer tries to quit drinking, Marge confronts the possibility of an emotional affair, Lisa develops feelings for a substitute teacher, Bart faces being held back a grade and has to genuinely reckon with academic failure. These are the kinds of situations real families navigate. Financial stress, marital tension, the slow grind of working-class life. The show was sharp and funny and sometimes deeply kind, but it was rooted in something recognizable. After the coma, the show changes in a way that is not subtle. Homer goes to space. Mr. Burns captures the Loch Ness Monster. Homer becomes the leader of a vigilante squad. Homer joins a secret society that has been running the world for centuries. Homer discovers his mother is a fugitive radical living underground. Homer meets God. Twice. The escalation is not gradual, it is seismic. Over the course of a few seasons, the show goes from depicting the realistic struggles of a working-class family to depicting a world where the main character has met multiple sitting presidents, traveled to dozens of countries, held hundreds of jobs across every conceivable profession, befriended and spent time with an astonishing number of celebrities, and survived physical trauma that would end a platoon of soldiers. The internet has been asking the question of when The Simpsons got bad for going on 20 years. There is a whole discourse around the concept of The Simpsons' quality decline, with passionate arguments about which specific season represents the turning point, which episode was the last great one, when the writers stopped caring. The coma theory cuts through all of that with a single answer. The Simpsons did not get bad. Homer's brain got worse. The show that exists after season 4 is not a different show made by lazier writers. It is the same show filtered through the progressively deteriorating mind of a man in a coma. The early post-coma seasons still have structure and emotional coherence because Homer's brain is freshly damaged but still largely functional. As the seasons progress and the brain degrades further, the stories become more fragmented, more surreal, more disconnected from cause and effect. The timeline becomes impossible to follow. Characters behave inconsistently. Consequences vanish between episodes. Reality bends in ways that a waking mind would find jarring, but a dreaming mind generates automatically. And here is the detail that has stayed with people who encounter this theory for the first time. 6 months before the coma episode, in the season 4 premiere, in an episode called Homer the Heretic, Homer has a direct conversation with God. An actual face-to-face exchange, rendered with characteristic Simpsons humor, but played within the episode as a genuine theological encounter. And during that conversation, God tells Homer that he will learn the meaning of life. But not yet. God tells Homer that his time is coming. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. The timeline is exact. Within the show's own continuity, a divine figure told Homer Simpson that his conscious life was nearly over. And 6 months later, it ended. What the show presents as a quirky theological gag is, under the coma theory, a prophecy. God was telling Homer that the life he knew was about to stop, and that everything which followed would be something else entirely, something between life and not life. A dream dreamed by a body that is still technically alive but no longer awake in any meaningful sense. The aging problem is where the coma theory becomes almost mathematically elegant. Nobody in The Simpsons ages. Bart has been 10 years old for 36 years. Lisa has been 8. Maggie has been a year old since 1989. Homer and Marge show no signs of physical aging across decades of episodes. The show uses what is called a floating timeline, a narrative device where the present is always the current year for the audience, and the characters exist in a kind of temporal stasis that lets the show stay contemporary without requiring its characters to grow older. Every major theory about The Simpsons has to account for this. The radiation theory proposes that the mutations have altered the character's biology in ways that prevent normal cellular aging. The simple explanation says it is just how animated shows work, that the Flintstones and the Jetsons and dozens of other long-running cartoons do the same thing, and it is a production convenience rather than a narrative statement. The coma theory has the simplest possible answer, and it is the one that carries the most emotional weight. Nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen mind of a man who went under in April 1993. Homer's unconscious brain cannot imagine his children growing up because he was not there to watch it happen. His wife does not age because the last time he saw her, she looked exactly the way she looks in every episode. His friends, his neighbors, his father, his co-workers, they are all preserved at the exact ages they were on the day Homer lost consciousness. The coma dream does not generate a future because it cannot access one. It only has the past. And so it runs the past over and over, with variations, constructing scenarios from the emotional and sensory memories of a man who fell asleep on a Tuesday in 1993 and has been dreaming ever since. Comas do something specific to the relationship between memory and time. People who emerge from extended comas consistently describe a subjective experience that is not unconsciousness, but something more like a state of preserved awareness, where the mind keeps running without external input, where the world inside the head continues even as the world outside goes on without it. Homer's coma dream preserves his world exactly as it was, because that is what the mind does when it is cut off from new experience. It runs what it has. The celebrity appearances in the later seasons find a particularly elegant explanation under this framework. Homer's brain, lying in a hospital room, is still receiving input, not in any organized or coherent way, but ambient sound leaks through, a television left on in the corridor, visitors in the next room having conversations, a radio playing somewhere down the hall. Names float past, voices, cultural references, and Homer's dreaming mind picks these up and incorporates them into the simulation because that is what dreaming minds do. They take whatever fragments of external reality are available and weave them into the existing narrative. That is why the later seasons are flooded with celebrity guest appearances. Springfield did not actually become a magnet for famous people. Homer's brain heard a name through the fog of unconsciousness and built a character around it, inserting them into the dream because the dream needed new material, and that was the only new material available. The show itself engaged with this theory in season 34, in an episode that included what was described as a deliberately leaked fake deleted scene in which Homer wakes up from a long coma and it is revealed that every outlandish episode was a dream. The scene was animated, it was voiced, it was produced with the same care as any official Simpsons content. And then the show said it was a hoax, a fake scene planted by fictional hackers, not something the production actually made. The fact that they made it at all is significant. The writers know the theory. They have engaged with it seriously enough to produce an animated response. They showed the audience the exact ending the theory predicts, and then told them it was a joke. Executive producer Al Jean addressed the theory directly in 2015 and dismissed it as fan speculation, stating simply that it was not true. But here is what Al Jean did not address. He did not explain why nobody ages. He did not explain the tonal shift after season 4. He did not explain why God told Homer his time was coming 6 months before the coma. He did not explain why the show has become progressively more surreal and internally contradictory with each passing season, in exactly the pattern you would expect from a dream being generated by a slowly deteriorating brain. He said it was not true and moved on, and the interview moved with him. The fans did not move on, because the theory does something that no official explanation has done. It makes the show make sense. Not in a debunking way, not in a way that diminishes the show or reveals it as lesser. It makes it make sense as a complete narrative, one that is stranger and sadder and more beautiful than anything the show has ever said out loud. Think about what the dream actually contains. Homer, unconscious in a hospital bed, constructs a world where he still has his family, where Marge still loves him, where Bart is still his mischievous, exhausting, infuriating, beloved little boy, where Lisa still plays her saxophone in the evenings, where Maggie is still small enough to hold, where Friday night at the Simpson house is still something that exists, that keeps existing, that keeps coming back around every week. His children never grow up in the dream because he did not get to watch them grow up. His wife does not change because the last version of her he carries is the one from before the accident. And every catastrophe that happens in Springfield, every disaster, every impossible event, every world-ending crisis gets resolved by the end of the episode because Homer's dreaming brain refuses to let the story end in a way that takes his family from him. That is not lazy writing. That is the coma theory's most devastating implication. The reset button, the thing that critics have cited for 20 years as evidence of the show losing its nerve, the reason why nothing that happens in Springfield ever has lasting consequences, that reset is Homer, Homer's brain, refusing to let any version of the story end in grief. Refusing to generate a dream where he loses his family, because losing his family is the one thing his sleeping mind cannot process. Every time the world resets, every time Homer survives something that should have killed him, every time a catastrophe is forgotten by the following week, that is a father in a hospital bed, keeping the dream alive because the alternative is either waking up and discovering how much time has passed, or not waking up at all. The coma theory does not ruin The Simpsons. It makes every single episode into an act of love, a man dreaming about his family because they are the only thing worth dreaming about. A dying mind building a house on Evergreen Terrace and keeping the lights on forever, because as long as the dream runs, the family is still there, the kids are still young, the beer is still cold, and nobody has to say goodbye. Section 3. Who really shot Mr. Burns? Before you say Maggie, stay with this for a moment. Because the case was never really closed. The summer of 1995 was one of the most unusual moments in the history of animated television. The Simpsons had reached a level of cultural saturation that allowed it to attempt something no animated show had ever tried before: a genuine whodunit mystery, designed as a two-part season finale and season premiere, with enough deliberately planted clues that the show's creators believed viewers at home could work out the answer before the reveal. Fox promoted it like a cultural event. America's Most Wanted ran a tie-in segment treating the fictional crime as an actual unsolved case. A national contest was organized. Viewers were invited to submit their guesses for who shot Burns, with the promise that the winner would be animated into a future episode of the show. The setup was this: Mr. Burns had, over the course of Season 6's finale, managed to make an enemy of virtually every person in Springfield. He had stolen an oil well from beneath Springfield Elementary School, gutting the school's budget and devastating its programs. He had used his financial influence to force Moe's Tavern out of business, bankrupting its owner. He had created a sinkhole that destroyed the Springfield retirement castle, displacing elderly residents, including Grandpa Simpson. He had hired Santa's little helper for a greyhound racing scheme that left the family dog injured. And for his finale, the act that pushed the entire town past its breaking point, he built a massive mechanical device and used it to block the sun over Springfield. Not figuratively. He physically blotted out the sun so that every resident of the town would be forced to buy their electricity from his power plant, because they would no longer have any other source of light or heat. When Smithers, his loyal assistant, objected to this plan, Burns fired him immediately. By the end of Part 1, there was not a single person in Springfield who did not have a reason to want Burns dead. The show took its time establishing this. It showed you Homer's breaking point, built from years of Burns being unable to remember his name despite Homer working for the man for the entirety of his adult life. It showed you Bart and Lisa's anger over the school. It showed you Grandpa Simpson's displacement from the retirement home. It showed you groundskeeper Willie's fury at losing his job in the chaos. It showed you Tito Puente's rage over the music program being cut. It showed you Moe's desperation. It showed you Smithers, freshly fired and unraveling. The entire town gathered at a public meeting to confront Burns, and the tension was dense enough that multiple characters were visibly carrying weapons when they arrived. Burns addressed the crowd, announced his sun-blocking scheme, and was shot. He staggered away from the meeting, fell against the town's sundial, and collapsed with his hands resting on two specific letters, W and S, or, from Burns's own perspective, M and S. The ambulance took him away. The screen went dark. America had a summer to think about it. When Part 2 aired in September 1995, the investigation played out like a satirical detective procedural. Chief Wiggum and the Springfield police stumbled through the case with characteristic incompetence. Smithers confessed almost immediately, but his confession fell apart when it emerged that he had been blackout drunk at the time and had actually shot a completely different person in a completely different location. He shot old Jasper in his wooden leg. Wrong victim. Wrong crime. One by one, the most prominent suspects were eliminated. Principal Skinner produced an alibi. Moe produced an alibi. Tito Puente produced what the show presented as the greatest alibi in television history, an elaborate samba performance in which he explained, musically and in detail, how he had channeled all of his rage into artistic expression rather than violence. The investigation stalled until the police recovered a key piece of physical evidence, an eyelash found on Burns's suit. DNA analysis confirmed it belonged to a Simpson. Homer's fingerprints were found on the weapon. He had the most clearly documented motive of anyone in the crowd. He was arrested and was hours away from being convicted when Burns emerged from his coma, identified his attacker, and the answer turned out to be Maggie. Baby Maggie Simpson, 1 year old, who had encountered Burns in the parking lot after the town meeting and, in the struggle over her lollipop, came into possession of his gun just as it discharged. Case closed. Except the contest that Fox ran to find the person who had figured this out produced essentially no correct guesses from an enormous pool of entries. The DVD commentary confirms this. Writers on the show acknowledged that, in a randomly selected sample of thousands of submissions, not a single person guessed Maggie as the shooter. The person who received the prize was chosen randomly from the sample pool, did not have the right answer, and received a cash payment instead of the animated appearance they had been promised. because the animated appearance had been contingent on having solved the mystery, and nobody had. The writers were aware of one person who had posted the correct answer to an online Simpsons discussion group on the night the original episode aired. This person was using a college internet account, and by the time the contest concluded and producers attempted to track them down, the account had been deactivated. They were never found. The show even issued an open invitation on the DVD release for this person to come forward. As far as anyone knows, they never did. Think about what this means for the mystery itself. The show was designed as a solvable puzzle. Viewers were told the clues were sufficient. A national contest was built on this premise. And when the answer came, essentially no one had arrived at it through the available evidence. Either the clues were genuinely insufficient, or the red herrings were so effective that the real answer was functionally indistinguishable from the false ones, or the answer did not logically follow from the evidence in the way the creators believed it did. Now look at the specific clues. Burns falls on the sundial. His hands rest on the letters W and S, which from his own perspective read as M and S. The show presents this as pointing to Maggie Simpson. Burns himself, however, stated on the record within the episode that his hands resting on those letters was not intentional. He did not deliberately position himself to spell out his attacker's initials. He fell, and his hands landed where they landed. The central physical clue, the piece of evidence the show uses most prominently to justify its answer, was explicitly described by the victim as coincidental. The sundial means nothing, according to the person whose fall was supposed to make it meaningful. Then there is the gun. Burns carried a gun in a holster. Before the shooting, the show briefly displays the holster empty. Burns's gun was already missing from his person before the attack occurred. This means whoever shot him used his own weapon, which they must have come into possession of at some point between the town meeting and the shooting. This significantly narrows the profile of the shooter. It was not someone who arrived at the confrontation armed and planning violence. It was someone who was not carrying a weapon, who encountered Burns's gun by chance, and who used it in a moment of opportunity or impulse. A baby finding a gun on the ground fits this profile. So, does anyone else who was at that meeting without their own weapon and who could have encountered Burns afterward in a private enough space to take the gun from him? There is also Burns's last spoken phrase before the shooting. The show depicts him saying, as he encounters his attacker, the words, "Oh, it's you." He is not surprised. He is not afraid. He acknowledges the person in front of him the way you would acknowledge someone you have met before and do not consider a threat. Does Burns recognize Maggie Simpson? Has he ever, at any point before this episode, interacted meaningfully with an infant from the Simpson family? The show does not establish any relationship between Burns and Maggie before the shooting. Burns barely recognizes Homer, the man who works for him every day. The idea that he would look at a baby and say, "Oh, it's you," in a tone of recognition rather than bafflement, does not track with a man who has repeatedly demonstrated an inability to remember his own employee's name. Then there is Homer's confession. In season 18, Homer claims out loud and on camera that he was actually the one who shot Burns. He says it directly. Nobody investigates. Nobody reopens the case. Homer Simpson confesses to the attempted murder of the richest and most powerful man in Springfield, and the show treats it as a throwaway line, something said and forgotten in the same moment. Either Homer is lying for attention, which is entirely consistent with his character, or he is telling the truth, and the original verdict was wrong. And if Homer did it, then Maggie was framed. A 1-year-old child was blamed for a crime committed by her father. The DNA evidence that pointed to a Simpson was correct. It just pointed to the wrong Simpson. And the physical evidence, the sundial reading, Burns's identification from a coma recovery bed, the testimony of a man who had just had a bullet removed and was still oriented from surgical sedation, was either misinterpreted or shaped by someone with a reason to direct it toward a conclusion that would end the investigation without producing a conviction. Chief Wiggum says it himself. No jury in the world would convict a baby. Identifying Maggie as the shooter was the cleanest possible solution to a politically complicated case. A baby cannot be prosecuted. A baby cannot be incarcerated. A baby cannot even be meaningfully questioned. Pointing at Maggie ends everything. The case closes. The town moves on, and whoever actually pulled the trigger goes home. The Marge theory, developed in detail by fans who spent significant time with the original episodes, presents a case that is uncomfortable in its coherence. Marge had watched Burns systematically destroy everything that mattered to her family: the school her children attended, the retirement home where her father-in-law lived, the family dog, the son. And Burns was once, in an earlier episode, depicted as having developed an infatuation with Marge. He fell, in some distorted way, in love with her. Under this theory, when Burns encountered his shooter in the parking lot, he recognized the person he had feelings for. And rather than name her, he protected her. He woke from his coma and directed the investigation toward the most convenient, innocent party available, an infant who could not be punished and who would not even understand the accusation. There is also the matter of the alternate endings. A complete alternate version of the Part 2 resolution was animated, in which Smithers is revealed as the shooter, full length, fully voiced, fully produced. This was screened during the Simpsons' 138th episode Spectacular, hosted by Troy McClure, who dismisses it by saying that accepting Smithers as the shooter would require ignoring all the Simpson DNA evidence, which would be, in his words, downright nutty. And then Troy McClure makes a direct reference to the O.J. Simpson trial, in which a jury ignored DNA evidence to reach an acquittal. The show is winking at you. It is telling you, through the mouth of a character played specifically for satirical effect, that DNA evidence gets ignored all the time, that the official answer is not necessarily the right answer, that the people with the most to protect are the ones who shape what the evidence is allowed to say. An early draft of the script had Barney Gumble as the shooter. The writers considered this seriously enough to develop it as a genuine option, with plans to send Barney to prison as a consequence. It was abandoned, but the fact remains that the show's own creators cycled through multiple different shooters before settling on Maggie. The clues were not designed to lead inevitably to one answer. An answer was chosen, and the clues were arranged around it. The mystery was reverse-engineered. And in a town where everything works that way, where the official version of reality is the one that best serves the people with power over the narrative, the greatest mystery in the show's history was not solved. It was closed. And in Springfield, those have never been the same thing. Section 4. M.R. Burns and the Machinery of Immortality. How is he still alive? This is not a rhetorical question. Within the established canon of The Simpsons, Charles Montgomery Burns is a medical impossibility. His age has been stated, implied, and contradicted across dozens of episodes, but every version of the timeline places his birth somewhere in the late 1800s. He has referenced personal memories from before the turn of the 20th century. He has described first-hand experiences from the 1910s. He has mentioned working relationships with historical figures who died decades before the show's audience was born. By the most conservative estimate, Burns is well over 100 years old. By the most generous reading of the show's continuity, the number might climb closer to 140. And he does not simply exist, he functions. He runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation with the sustained strategic attention that requires. He manipulates municipal politics. He orchestrates schemes that involve long-term planning, real-time decision-making, and a working comprehension of modern finance, modern law, and modern technology. His physical body is frail to the point of being almost theatrical, his grip too weak to harm anyone who resists him, his frame so skeletal that he seems like something the wind might carry off. But his mind is precise. Burns is arguably the most cognitively capable character in Springfield, operating with a strategic clarity that nobody around him can match. And he has been maintaining that cognitive function for longer than any human being should be capable of sustained thought. The show addresses his survival mechanism directly in the Springfield Files. As discussed in the first section, Burns undergoes a weekly medical treatment that causes his body to glow with visible radiation. The episode presents this as the explanation for Homer's alien sighting, and the glow is played for comedy. But the biological reality the show is depicting is not comedic. Burns requires a scheduled intervention to remain alive. The treatment keeps him functional for exactly 7 days. Without it, he dies. The margin for error is absolute. There is no grace period, no buffer, no provision for a missed appointment. The weekly treatment is not a supplement to Burns's natural health. It is his health. It is the only thing standing between a very old, very sick man and his own body's accumulated damage, and the treatment involves radiation. Of course it does. The man who has spent over a century in proximity to nuclear material, who owns a reactor that has been leaking contamination into the surrounding environment for decades, has a body that can no longer sustain itself through normal biological processes. He requires external radiation input the way a healthy person requires nutrition. His cellular function has been so thoroughly altered by a lifetime of nuclear exposure that it now depends on continued nuclear exposure to maintain even basic equilibrium. Burns is not surviving despite the radiation. He is surviving because of it. The plant did not damage him in the same way it damaged Springfield's residents. It did something stranger. It fundamentally re-architected his biology until he became dependent on it, the way a deep-sea organism becomes dependent on the pressure of the water around it. Remove the pressure, and the organism fails. Withdraw the radiation, and Burns follows within a week. This connects to what is probably the most famous medical scene in the show's history. Burns visits a doctor who informs him that he has every disease known to medical science. All of them. Simultaneously, the doctor explains that these diseases exist within Burns's body in a state of perfect equilibrium, each one competing with all the others, none of them able to gain dominance because every disease is being blocked by every other disease, trying to occupy the same biological space at the same time. The doctor calls this Three Stooges syndrome, comparing it to three people attempting to pass through a doorway simultaneously. None of them can move. The gridlock is the survival mechanism. The show plays this for one of its most quoted laughs, but it is describing something genuinely strange. Burns's diseases are not being treated. They are not being cured. They are simply being managed in a state of permanent stasis, balanced against each other in a configuration that keeps any single illness from progressing far enough to cause death. And this equilibrium is not natural. Natural disease progression does not work this way. Left to themselves, diseases in a single host do not spontaneously achieve perfect counterbalancing. Something is maintaining that balance. The weekly radiation treatments are doing it. The radiation does not eliminate the diseases. It holds them in place. It keeps the equilibrium stable. It prevents any single condition from gaining the foothold that would allow it to break through and kill him. Burns's body is a reactor that requires management. The treatments are the equivalent of adjusting the control mechanisms to prevent a cascade failure. Too much intervention and the balance shifts. Too little and the stasis collapses. The weekly schedule exists because that is the precision the system requires. Smithers is the system's operator. This is the part of the Burns-Smithers dynamic that gets discussed least when people talk about their relationship. Yes, Smithers' devotion to Burns is a defining element of the show, a source of humor, of pathos, of some of the show's most genuinely touching moments. But the nature of that devotion is practical as much as emotional. Smithers manages Burns' schedule. He ensures Burns makes every weekly medical appointment. He monitors Burns' physical condition with an attentiveness that goes well beyond normal workplace dedication. He is functionally Burns' medical coordinator, the person who keeps the entire biological maintenance system running. The show has established repeatedly that without Smithers, Burns would be helpless. But it is more specific than general helplessness. Without Smithers managing the treatment schedule with the precision it requires, Burns would miss a dose. The disease equilibrium would destabilize. Everything in his body that has been held at bay for over a century would surge forward at once. Smithers is not just devoted to Burns out of some complicated mixture of professional loyalty and personal feeling. Smithers understands at some level that his own absence is a death sentence. His presence is not emotional support, it is a life support function. And this reframes something about their relationship that the show handles carefully, without ever making explicit. Burns holds enormous power over Smithers through the nature of their employer-employee dynamic, through class, through the social architecture of Springfield. But Smithers holds a power over Burns that Burns cannot replace. The knowledge of how the treatment protocol works, the reliability of someone who will actually maintain the schedule, the institutional memory of a medical regimen so specific and so critical that a single missed appointment is fatal. They need each other. Not symmetrically, not in the same way, but genuinely and irreplaceably. Burns's connection to historical events adds another layer to the immortality question that the show drops casually and never excavates fully. Burns has described interactions with Howard Hughes. He attended Yale. He served in the Second World War, in a capacity the show implies was morally at best ambiguous. He claims to have been personally in possession of a $1 trillion bill that the United States government issued during the war, which he kept hidden for decades. He references the Gilded Age of American history not as something he read about, but as something he experienced directly. His family wealth predates the Industrial Revolution, and the Burns dynasty, as the show occasionally depicts it, extends back centuries further than that. The show has depicted the Burns family tree as one of the oldest and most continuously powerful lineages in American history. Not wealthy in the sense of having accumulated money over a generation or two. Wealthy in the structural sense, the kind of wealth that builds the infrastructure other people depend on and then collects payment for access to it forever. The kind of wealth that exists at such a distance from ordinary accountability that the concept of legal consequence becomes theoretical rather than practical. Burns inherited this legacy and has been extending it for well over a century, which raises a question the show gestures at without answering. Is Burns unique in his longevity, or does the Burns dynasty have a history of employing unusual measures to extend the lifespans of its patriarchs? The family has maintained uninterrupted control of its fortune across a span of time during which most American institutions have been built, destroyed, rebuilt, and transformed beyond recognition. That kind of continuity requires either extraordinary luck sustained across generations, or deliberate strategies for ensuring that control does not pass through normal succession. Before nuclear medicine, before the weekly treatments, before the technology that currently maintains Burns's existence, was there something else? The show does not say. But it establishes clearly that whatever the Burns family has been doing, it has worked, and it has worked for a very long time. Burns has come close to death more times than almost any other character on the show. He was shot by Maggie. He has been hospitalized across dozens of episodes. He has collapsed, fallen, been attacked, been poisoned, been abandoned in wilderness conditions that would kill a person half his age. And every time, he comes back. Not through the cartoon resilience that allows Homer to walk away from falls that should be fatal. Burns comes back through infrastructure, through money, through the machinery of wealth that ensures there will always be someone with the resources and the expertise to restore him, regardless of what happens to his physical form. Homer's survival is passive. The show needs Homer alive, and so Homer survives. Burns's survival is engineered. He has spent a century constructing a system designed to guarantee his continuation, regardless of circumstances, and every component of that system serves the same single purpose. Keep Burns alive. Keep the treatments scheduled. Keep the diseases balanced. Keep the reactor running. Because if Burns dies, the empire he built dies with him, and empires do not permit themselves to die. The most unsettling part of the Burns immortality theory is not the possibility of his endless life. It is the way Springfield's survival is entangled with it. The town's economy depends on the power plant. The power plant depends on Burns. Burns depends on the medical infrastructure his wealth provides. The infrastructure depends on the continued operation of the plant. It is a closed system, a loop that cannot be broken from inside without causing the entire thing to collapse. Springfield cannot bring down Burns without destroying its own economic foundation. Burns cannot die without dismantling the system that ensures the treatments keep coming. He is not immortal in any supernatural sense. He is something more mundane and more durable than immortality. He is too expensive to die. And Springfield will keep paying that cost for as long as Burns keeps the lights on. Section 5. The Principle and the Truth Springfield Made Illegal. There is one episode of The Simpsons that fans have spent nearly 30 years arguing represents the show at its worst. An episode so despised by a portion of the audience that its existence is frequently cited as the moment the show stopped caring about its own internal logic, the moment the writers betrayed the audience's investment in the characters, the moment The Simpsons ceased to be the show it once was. Season 9, Episode 2, The Principal and the Pauper. It aired on the 28th of September, 1997. And the people who call it the worst episode of The Simpsons are not wrong about what it does. They are simply wrong about what it means. Here is the plot. Springfield Elementary holds a ceremony honoring Principal Seymour Skinner's 20 years of service to the school. During the celebration, a stranger walks in. A man no one in Springfield has ever seen. He introduces himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner, a decorated Vietnam War veteran who was captured as a prisoner of war and believed dead in Southeast Asia. He survived. He escaped. He came home. and he found that the life he had left behind had been taken by someone else. The man Springfield has known as Principal Seymour Skinner for 20 years is an imposter. His real name is Armin Tamzarian. Before the war, Tamzarian was a street criminal from the wrong side of the city, a kid with no prospects and no future who was drafted into the army and assigned to the same unit as the real Skinner. When Skinner was captured and presumed killed, Tamzarian felt the weight of it personally. He traveled to Springfield to deliver the news to Skinner's mother, Agnes. Agnes, upon seeing him, assumed he was her son. She was in grief and she needed someone to be Seymour Skinner. And Tamzarian, who had never been wanted anywhere, who had never had a family or a name worth protecting, allowed it. He became Seymour Skinner. He took the identity, the rank, the history, the mother, and he spent 20 years living inside a life that belonged to someone else. And then the real Skinner walked through the door, and the 20-year fiction collapsed in an afternoon. What Springfield does next is the episode's actual subject. The town holds a meeting. Both men are present. The truth is completely exposed and fully acknowledged. And the town votes not on prosecution, not on restitution, not on what should be done to restore the real Skinner's rightful place. They vote on whether to acknowledge the truth at all, and the verdict is unanimous in favor of the lie. Judge Snyder issues a legal decree, making Armin Tamzarian the legal and official Seymour Skinner, with all associated rights and history. The real Seymour Skinner, the man who survived a prisoner of war camp and came home after 20 years, is tied to a train and physically removed from Springfield. And the judge makes it a crime, punishable by torture, for anyone to ever mention the truth again. Fans hated this. The criticism was immediate and sustained. Harry Shearer, who provides the voice for both Skinner and Burns, publicly expressed his displeasure with the storyline. Critics argued that the episode destroyed one of the show's most consistently entertaining characters by replacing everything the audience knew about him with a constructed fiction. His military service was not his. His relationship with Agnes was not his. His complicated dynamic with Bart was built on borrowed identity. His entire personality, everything that made Skinner Skinner, was a performance assembled from pieces of another man's life. This criticism is accurate. The episode does do all of those things. But it does something else that gets overlooked in the backlash, something more important than any damage it does to a single character. It shows you the mechanism. Springfield has always operated this way. The town has always chosen the comfortable version of reality over the accurate one. It has always agreed, collectively and efficiently, to forget whatever does not fit the narrative. It has always treated the maintenance of the agreed-upon version of events as more important than the truth the agreed-upon version was built to replace. The difference here is that for once, the show lets you watch it happen in real time. The vote is on screen. The legal decree is spoken aloud. The exile of the truth is depicted literally. A man tied to a train and removed from the community so that the lie can continue undisturbed. Every other time Springfield forgets a catastrophe or resets to normal after something world-altering happens, it happens off-screen, between episodes, without ceremony. The town was sealed under a dome. The next episode, nobody mentions it. The town was destroyed and rebuilt. The following week, the rubble is gone. A nuclear near-miss occurred. By Thursday, the plant is operating normally. The show presents these resets as a narrative convention, episodic storytelling, the normal mechanics of a long-running series that does not want to be burdened by its own continuity. The Principal and the Pauper is the only episode that makes you watch the reset happen. The only episode that shows you Springfield actively choosing to discard the truth and encode the replacement into law. And in doing so, it accidentally reveals the engine that has been running the entire show. Consider how many times Springfield has experienced something that should permanently alter the town's reality. The dome. The multiple destructions and reconstructions. The nuclear incident. The alien encounters that were not alien encounters. The sun being blocked. An entire governor's race conducted around the question of whether the town's water supply was being poisoned by its primary employer. Each of these events, by any reasonable standard of narrative logic, should leave a mark, should change something, should at minimum be remembered. They are not. The slate is wiped. The loop resets. And fans have been arguing about why for decades, proposing everything from production laziness to the coma theory's dreaming brain to the radiation theory's cognitive damage as the explanation. The principal and the pauper offers a fourth explanation, and it is the one that requires the least additional theorizing because it is depicted directly. Springfield resets because the town collectively chooses to reset. Deliberately. Through an unspoken social contract that says we will not acknowledge what happened, we will maintain the agreed-upon version of reality, and anyone who threatens that agreement will be removed. The reset is not an accident of cartoon storytelling. It is a community defense mechanism. It is what a town does when the truth is more expensive than the fiction. Think about the chain of acknowledgement Springfield is trying to avoid. If the town acknowledged the dome, it would have to acknowledge the pollution. If it acknowledged the pollution, it would have to confront the power plant. If it confronted the power plant, it would have to challenge Burns. If it challenged Burns, the economy would collapse. If the economy collapsed, the town would die. So the town does not acknowledge the dome. The town does not remember the dome. The dome did not happen, and if you insist that it did, you will be tied to a train and expelled from the community. The real Seymour Skinner was Springfield's canary in the coal mine. A man who arrived with proof that the official story was false, who presented himself as the living evidence of a 20-year lie, who asked the town to reckon with the gap between what they believed and what was true. And the town's response was to criminalize his presence, not his crime, because he committed no crime. His presence. His existence as the person whose arrival made the comfortable lie impossible to sustain. That is not a comedy beat. That is the show diagnosing a behavioral pattern that appears in real communities with a regularity that makes the fictional version feel like documentary rather than satire. Small towns, institutions, families, organizations of every kind develop elaborate mechanisms for maintaining the version of themselves they can live with, and those mechanisms almost always involve some form of exile for anyone who insists on the version that is actually true. Springfield made it legal. That is the only difference. In real communities, the exile is social rather than literal. The person who knows too much is not tied to a train. They are simply not invited to things anymore. Their calls are not returned. Their version of events is not repeated. The town closes around the lie and the liar is on the outside of it, correct and isolated and effectively gone. Armin Tamzarian is still playing Seymour Skinner. Springfield is still pretending everything is fine. And the real Seymour Skinner is somewhere past the town limits. The last honest man in a community that made honesty criminal. That is not a bad episode. That is the show's most honest moment, wrapped in the one storyline fans wanted it to retract. Section 6. Maggie Simpson and the silence that is power. Maggie Simpson does not talk. She does not walk reliably. She communicates primarily through the sound her pacifier makes, and the occasional look in her enormous eyes that somehow manages to contain the full emotional range of an adult who has seen things. She is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. And in that time, without speaking a single sustained sentence, without walking across a room without falling, she has accomplished more remarkable things than every other member of her family combined. She shot a billionaire. She organized and led a successful rebellion against a tyrannical caretaker in a daycare facility. She has saved her family from multiple life-threatening situations, acting with a clarity and speed that adults in the same situations failed to match. She has demonstrated problem-solving capabilities that exceed those of grown adults, operating in the same scenarios. She has been tested and found to possess intelligence that should not exist in a child who has not yet learned to form sentences. And through all of it, every remarkable thing she has ever done, every time she has been the person who actually handled the crisis, she maintains her silence. Not because she cannot speak, because she chooses not to. The shooting is where most discussions of Maggie begin and end, because it is the most dramatic thing she has done and because it plugs directly into the Burns mystery. But we have already been through that. What matters for understanding Maggie is not who shot whom. It is what happened in the room after everyone else left. The resolution of the who shot Mr. Burns storyline plays out, Maggie is identified, the case is closed, the investigation disperses. And then the episode shows you one final image. The room is empty. Maggie is alone. She looks around carefully, methodically, checking every corner and entrance point, confirming that no one is watching. And then she moves her pacifier in a motion that mirrors pulling a trigger. This sequence requires unpacking. The motion is too specific and too deliberate to be reflexive. Babies do not produce complex, contextually appropriate mime behavior randomly. The sequence requires situational awareness because she checked the room first. It requires memory because she is recreating something that happened earlier. It requires caution because she specifically confirmed privacy before performing the gesture. And it requires an understanding at some level that what she is reenacting has significance, that doing it in front of other people would have consequences. Those are not infant behaviors. Those are the behaviors of someone who understands exactly what they did, who understands that the world around them has assigned significance to that action, and who has decided that performing the gesture privately is acceptable while performing it publicly is not. That is a level of social and situational awareness that should not exist in a 1-year-old. And yet there it is, in a canonical episode, depicted without ambiguity. The Longest Daycare is the piece of work that makes the Maggie theory impossible to dismiss. It is a 7-minute theatrical short film, released in 2012 and screened in cinemas, that was nominated for an Academy Award. It contains no dialogue from Maggie. It is almost entirely without spoken words, and it depicts Maggie navigating an authoritarian daycare facility with a level of cognitive sophistication that would be remarkable in an adult, let alone in a child who cannot yet walk reliably. The premise is simple. Maggie is left at the Ayn Rand School for Tots. Inside, she discovers a caterpillar in the process of forming a chrysalis. She wants to protect it. Another infant, a recurring antagonist named Gerald the baby with one eyebrow, wants to destroy it. What follows is a miniature action film, structurally identical to adult heist and rescue movies, in which Maggie conducts a detailed analysis of the facility's environment, identifies the specific threats and obstacles between her and the caterpillar, develops a strategy, adjusts the strategy when conditions change, and executes a multi-step plan that requires spatial reasoning, timing, the ability to predict other people's behavior, and the capacity to improvise effectively when the plan encounters unexpected resistance. She does all of this without speaking. She does it while physically limited to the motor capabilities of a 1-year-old. She falls frequently. She cannot run the way she needs to. She is physically outmatched by the older children and the facility's infrastructure. But her decision-making is not compromised by any of this. Every choice she makes is the correct one. Every adjustment to her plan is the optimal one. She is operating at a cognitive level that her body cannot support, and she compensates for that gap through pure intellectual precision. Her body is baby-sized. Her mind is not. The show has tested Maggie's intelligence directly in various episodes, and the results, while played for quick jokes, consistently point in the same direction. In some episodes, the testing apparatus literally breaks because it cannot measure a score that high. In others, the numbers that emerge are described in hushed tones by the adults administering the test before the scene cuts away. The exact figures change. The implication does not. Maggie's intelligence is not normal. It is not even conventionally exceptional. It is in a category that the available measurement tools are not designed to accommodate. And nobody notices. Or, perhaps more accurately, nobody notices persistently. The family sees evidence of it and then forgets, because the family is busy. Homer is managing whatever his current disaster is. Bart is managing whatever prank he is running or consequence he is evading. Lisa is managing her ongoing project of trying to improve a world that has very little interest in being improved. Marge is managing everything, the way Marge always is, with a patience that the show slowly reveals is more complicated than it appears. In the middle of all this operational chaos, Maggie sits quietly, and whatever she is doing in that quiet goes unexamined. The theory is that this is strategic, that Maggie's silence is not a developmental delay, that it is not a narrative convenience for the show's writers, that it is a conscious, calculated decision made by a mind intelligent enough to recognize what talking would cost her. Look at Lisa. Lisa is Maggie's template, the reference point from which Maggie has been learning since before she could form consistent memories. Lisa is the most intellectually gifted member of the Simpson family by a significant margin. Lisa is a genuine genius, and the show has explored in honest and sometimes painful detail what that means for her life in Springfield. It means isolation. It means being the smartest person in virtually every room she enters and having that intelligence received, more often than not, as an irritant. It means being dismissed by the adults who should be learning from her. It means being mocked by her peers. It means caring deeply about things that nobody around her finds worth caring about, and having the clarity to see exactly why things are the way they are without having the power to change them. Lisa's intelligence is her most defining characteristic and the source of her deepest suffering. She wears it visibly. She announces herself as the person who knows, and the world around her consistently makes certain she understands how little that matters. Maggie has watched this. She has been watching it since the day she was born. She has observed, with whatever version of long-term pattern recognition a one-year-old superintelligence possesses, exactly what being visibly intelligent costs in Springfield. She has watched her sister fight every day for recognition and receive resistance. She has seen the system respond to demonstrated capability with suspicion rather than appreciation, and she has drawn a different conclusion than Lisa drew. Lisa's conclusion was, keep fighting regardless of the cost. Keep being who you are. Keep insisting on the truth even when the truth is unwelcome. Maggie's conclusion was, silence is the most powerful position available. Invisibility is armor. The less they notice you, the more freedom you have to operate. Think about the functional reality of this for a moment. Every time Maggie does something remarkable, what actually happens afterward? The family does not organize around her. The community does not restructure itself in response to what she has demonstrated. Burns was shot, and the investigation focused on every other member of the Simpson family before reluctantly arriving at the baby, because who suspects the baby? The daycare rebellion succeeded precisely because no adult monitoring system is designed to account for infants with operational intelligence. Every heroic act, every display of capability, every moment where Maggie is the one who actually handles the crisis, it happens below the level where Springfield pays attention. And Maggie has ensured this by maintaining the most effective disguise available to her. She performs exactly what everyone expects from a baby: quiet, passive, dependent, occasionally charming. She gives the people around her what they expect to see, and in the space that their expectations create, she does whatever she is actually doing. She is none of the things they think she is. She is the opposite of most of them. She is the most capable person in the Simpson family, and she has spent 36 years making absolutely certain that nobody puts that sentence together. Now, bring the radiation theory back into this, because it adds a dimension that makes the Maggie story feel like something the show has been building toward without acknowledging. If Springfield's contamination creates mutations that affect each person differently, then Maggie represents the far end of a spectrum that Homer occupies at the opposite extreme. Homer's mutation reduced his cognitive function to the point of clinical disability. Maggie's mutation did the inverse. The same contaminated water, the same irradiated air, the same environmental exposure, but where it diminished the father, it amplified the daughter. Homer and Maggie are two outcomes of the same cause. He is what happens when mutation takes something away. She is what happens when mutation gives something extraordinary. And if the coma theory is true, Maggie's genius takes on an emotional dimension that is harder to sit with. If Homer is dreaming, if every episode since April 1993 is the construction of an unconscious mind trying to preserve its connection to the family it cannot reach, then Maggie's capabilities are Homer's deepest hope for his youngest child, rendered in dream logic. He cannot watch her grow. He cannot be there for whatever she becomes. He cannot know if she will be all right without him. So his dreaming mind makes her extraordinary. It makes her capable of handling anything. It makes her the person who saves the family when everyone else is overwhelmed, not because that is the statistically likely outcome, but because a father in a hospital bed needs to believe that his baby will be okay. That she has what she needs. That whatever happens, Maggie Simpson will be fine. Her genius is not a mutation. In the coma theory, it is a prayer. But even setting both theories aside, even approaching Maggie purely from the evidence the show has directly provided, the mystery of what she is waiting for remains. She watches everything. She understands everything. She has demonstrated repeatedly and unambiguously that she is operating at a level nobody around her has fully accounted for, and she keeps choosing silence, keeps choosing invisibility, keeps sitting quietly behind her pacifier with those enormous eyes taking in everything. The show has never told us what Maggie is waiting for. It has never revealed what she plans to do with 36 years of accumulated observation and intelligence. It has given us the accumulation and left the application unspecified. And maybe that is the most honest thing the show has ever done about its youngest character. We know what Homer wants. We know what Burns wants. We know what Lisa wants. Maggie is the one character whose endgame remains entirely unknown. And something that smart, that patient, that strategically invisible, having spent 36 years watching and learning and saying nothing about what it has learned, I should probably make everyone in Springfield slightly nervous. She just has not decided yet. Or perhaps more accurately, she has not decided to let anyone know what she has decided. Section 7. The predictions and the show that shaped the future. For the past several years, The Simpsons has been more famous in some corners of the internet for what it allegedly predicted than for anything it actually depicted. Screenshots circulate constantly. Headlines appear every few months. The show's name appears in discussions about topics it has nothing to do with, because someone noticed that an episode from 15 or 20 years ago contained a detail that corresponds, in some degree of specificity, to a real-world event that happened after the episode aired. The Trump presidency, smartwatches, the Disney acquisition of 20th Century Fox, a specific tiger attack, a global pandemic with a corresponding murder hornet infestation, an improbable musical collaboration, a mathematical prediction about a subatomic particle. The list has been assembled and extended so many times that it has become a genre of its own, a cottage industry of compilation videos and social media posts, presenting The Simpsons as a kind of encoded prophetic document that the show's writers somehow accidentally produced. So let us actually sit with the evidence, because the reality is more interesting than either the conspiracy version or the simple dismissal version. Start with the one that started the modern iteration of this conversation. In the year 2000, an episode called Bart to the Future depicted The Simpsons universe's version of the future, in which Lisa Simpson has grown up to become the first female president of the United States. In that episode, her predecessor in the White House is identified as Donald Trump, presented as a joke about the logical extreme of American celebrity culture transforming into American political reality. The episode aired in the year 2000. Donald Trump won the United States presidential election in 2016, 16 years after the episode depicted him having already served as president. The internet response to this was, in its own way, a cultural event. Screenshots went viral across platforms. People who had not thought about The Simpsons in years were suddenly sharing clips and asking how the writers could have known. The phrase The Simpsons predicted it became a meme format, a reference point, a way of talking about the feeling of a reality that has become indistinguishable from satire. Then the list extended further. A 1,995 episode depicted a wristwatch-sized device with computing functions that bore a visual resemblance to the smartwatches that became consumer products beginning in the mid-2010s. A 1,994 episode sent Homer to space with Buzz Aldrin decades before commercial space tourism became a reality. A 1,998 episode depicted Homer encountering a mathematical equation that appears on examination by people with expertise in theoretical physics to correspond to a prediction about the mass of the Higgs boson particle. The Higgs boson was experimentally confirmed in 2012, 14 years after the episode. In a 1999 episode, Homer proposed a theory about the universe being donut-shaped. In the years following, cosmological research identified radiation patterns that some physicists interpreted as suggesting the universe might have a toroidal topology. A 1,993 episode called Marge in Chains depicted a flu virus originating in Asia spreading to Springfield, causing mass panic, competition for scarce resources, and a desperate search for a cure or vaccine. The episode aired 27 years before the COVID-19 pandemic began, and it did not stop there. During the fictional outbreak in that episode, the town accidentally released a swarm of killer bees. During the actual 2020 pandemic, Asian giant hornets, given the media nickname murder hornets, were identified in the United States for the first time. A 1,996 episode featured a throwaway joke about the hip-hop group Cypress Hill accidentally booking the London Symphony Orchestra. In 2024, Cypress Hill performed with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall. 28 years between the joke and the reality. The explanation the show's own creators offer for all of this is consistent and straightforward. Al Jean, who has served as executive producer since the show's early seasons, describes the prediction phenomenon as what happens when you throw enough darts. With nearly 800 episodes produced over 36 years, each containing multiple jokes, satirical observations, and extrapolations of current trends, the volume of content is simply large enough that some of it will align with future events through probability alone. Bill Oakley, who ran the show during several of its most beloved seasons, has said plainly that most of what appears to be prediction is actually coincidence, combined with the cyclical nature of history where patterns repeat in ways that make older material look prescient. Fact-checking organizations that have examined the most widely shared examples confirm this general framework. Many of the apparent predictions are based on trends that were already visible and measurable when the episodes were written. The Trump prediction was not conjured from nothing. Trump had been publicly discussing the possibility of running for president since the late 1980s. He was a known quantity in American celebrity culture. His name had appeared in discussions of hypothetical presidential candidates for over a decade before the episode was written. The writers did not predict Trump. They observed that he had been circling the idea of presidential politics for years and wrote a joke about the direction that was already in motion. The Disney-Fox merger was similar. Media consolidation was an accelerating trend throughout the 1990s. The idea of a major entertainment conglomerate absorbing a rival studio was less a prediction and more an observation about where the industry was obviously heading. The smartwatch was an extrapolation of the clearly established trend of computing devices becoming smaller and more personal. The space tourism episode was a joke about the already existing commercial spaceflight industry's long-term ambitions. The Simpsons writing staff has historically been one of the most formally educated in the history of American television. Multiple writers have held degrees from Harvard, Yale, and comparable institutions. Significant numbers have backgrounds in mathematics, physics, computer science, philosophy, and political theory. These are not people making random guesses. They are intelligent, deeply read observers of American culture who spend their professional lives studying patterns, analyzing trajectories, and extrapolating current conditions to their logical or absurd conclusions. They read the present carefully and project it forward. What looks like prophecy is usually rigorous trend analysis delivered in the form of a joke. But here is where the straightforward debunking starts to strain under its own weight. Some of the apparent predictions are not extrapolations of visible trends. Some of them are specific in ways that exceed what trend analysis should produce. The Trump episode did not just predict that a celebrity might run for president. It specified Trump by name. It depicted him in a way that visually mirrored, in notable detail, the staging of the announcement he actually made in 2015 when he descended an escalator to declare his candidacy. The episode contained a specific staging detail that was not a logical extension of any trend, but rather a compositional choice that turned out to match the reality 15 years later. The episode involving Siegfried and Roy, two performers famous for their Las Vegas show featuring trained white tigers, depicted one of the tigers attacking one of the performers. This is a scenario that seems logical given the act involved, but the specific detail of which performer and which animal and what kind of attack corresponded with uncomfortable precision to the real incident in 2003 when Roy Horn was critically injured by one of the show's tigers during a live performance. These are not trend extrapolations. These are coincidences of a specificity that statistical probability does not comfortably account for, and acknowledging this does not require abandoning the broader framework of explanation. It just means that the coincidences are, in some cases, genuinely strange. There is a more interesting version of the prediction story, though, one that does not require any element of the supernatural, and that is actually more significant than the simple coincidence argument. The Simpsons does not predict the future. The Simpsons shapes it. Consider the mechanism. The show has been running for 36 years. It is one of the most watched, most referenced, most deeply embedded pieces of American media in the history of the medium. Its jokes have entered the common language. Its observations about American culture have become part of how Americans understand themselves. When The Simpsons makes a joke about Trump becoming president in the year 2000, that joke does not exist in isolation. It enters the cultural bloodstream. Millions of people see it. It becomes a reference point. It becomes something people mention when Trump's name comes up in the context of political ambition. It makes the idea of a Trump presidency feel familiar, not shocking. It primes the cultural imagination to receive that possibility as something that has been anticipated rather than something unprecedented. The joke does not predict the future. The joke makes the future feel like something that was always going to happen. And when it happens, the recognition people feel, The Simpsons already did this sensation, is not the recognition of prophecy. It is the recognition of cultural preparation. The show set the expectations so thoroughly, so deeply, that the reality arriving feels like confirmation rather than surprise. This is how satire actually works when it is powerful enough and sustained enough and culturally penetrating enough to matter. It does not forecast the future, it normalizes it. It takes the trends already in motion and renders them as completed fact, and in doing so, it removes the psychological barrier between the current state and the eventual destination. The Simpsons showed you the Disney-Fox merger as an obvious joke about inevitable consolidation, and when the actual merger happened, the cultural response was not shock, it was recognition. Of course, The Simpsons already told us, Springfield does not reflect America. America, in some measurable cultural sense, has been reflecting Springfield for 30 years. The show held up a mirror, and the audience stared into it long enough to start resembling what they saw. The nuclear power plant as the central engine of community corruption and ecological damage. The billionaire employer who cannot be held accountable. The incompetent government. The population too distracted and too damaged to organize effective resistance to any of it. The endless cycle of catastrophe and reset. These are not Simpsons inventions. They are American realities that The Simpsons captured early, rendered in yellow, and showed back to the country at 8 o'clock on Sunday nights for 36 years. Springfield was not a prediction of where America was heading. Springfield was a diagnosis of where America already was. The show just wrote it down first. And the predictions that did not come true are never mentioned. The jetpacks, the moon colonies, the technology that was extrapolated from 1990s trends and went in completely different directions than the show imagined. The political outcomes that went the other way. The cultural shifts that never materialized. Thousands of jokes that did not correspond to anything that later happened, sitting in the archive unreferenced, unscreenshotted, unshared on social media, because confirmation bias is not symmetric. We are built to notice when the prediction lands. We are not built to track the miss. The actual ratio of hits to misses is buried in nearly 800 episodes of content. The hits are viral, the misses are invisible. And when you filter thousands of satirical observations through the most powerful confirmation bias amplification engine ever built, which is the internet, you end up with a highlight reel that looks like prophecy. The Simpsons wrote so many possible futures that some of them were mathematically certain to arrive. The ones that arrived are the only ones anyone remembers. But even knowing the mechanism, even understanding exactly how the trick works, there is something about sitting with the specific examples that is genuinely unsettling. 800 episodes, 36 years, thousands of observations about American culture rendered in the language of animated comedy, and enough bullseyes distributed among the misses to make even the people who made the show pause and wonder if they know something they should not. Section 8. Mona Simpson and 3 Generations of Damage. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. That was the official story. Abe Simpson had told Homer that his mother passed away when he was young. There was a grave. Homer had mourned. He had grown up believing he was a boy whose mother died early and whose father was too emotionally distant to fill the space she left. That belief had become the foundation of Homer's entire psychological structure, the invisible architecture underneath everything he was as an adult. His desperate need for approval, his terror of abandonment, his clinginess toward Marge, the way he reaches for her in moments of stress like a child reaching for the one reliable thing, his willingness to endure humiliation, dismissal, and contempt from Burns for years without quitting, because losing his job would mean losing the structure that keeps the fear at bay. Homer's relentless, sometimes exhausting, sometimes heartbreaking need to be loved by everyone around him, his inability to tolerate rejection even in its mildest social forms, all of it traces back to one point, a boy who believed his mother had preferred to die rather than stay. And then Season 7 told the truth. The episode is called Mother Simpson. It aired on the 19th of November, 1995, and it is regularly cited as one of the greatest single episodes the show ever produced. Homer fakes his own death to avoid working on a Saturday, which leads to a bureaucratic correction that requires him to visit the Hall of Records. And in those records, Homer finds something that changes everything. His mother is listed as alive. She never died. The grave Abe showed him was not hers. It was the grave of Walt Whitman, the poet. For the entirety of Homer's life, Abe Simpson had been pointing his son at a famous writer's headstone and telling him it belonged to his mother. Homer finds Mona at the cemetery, visiting what she believes is her son's grave, mourning a death that has not happened, standing before a headstone that belongs to neither of them. When they recognize each other, when the reunion actually happens, it is one of the most genuinely affecting moments in 36 seasons of a show that is, at its foundation, a comedy. A grown man and his mother separated for 27 years, finding each other in the specific place where each of them had been mourning the other. Then Mona explains why she left. The story begins in 1969. Mona Simpson was a housewife, married to Abe, the mother of young Homer, living a quiet life in Springfield while the civil rights movement and the anti-war protests were reshaping the world outside. She was radicalized by what she saw. She joined a group of activists, and their target was a biological weapons laboratory owned by Mr. Burns. This is the detail that the show drops into the story and then moves past quickly enough that its full implications do not land on first viewing. Burns did not just own a nuclear power plant with 342 safety violations. He owned a facility designed to produce biological weapons, a laboratory developing weaponized pathogens, located in Springfield, the same town where Homer was growing up, where children were attending the school that Burns's oil well would later gut, where families were living their ordinary lives with no knowledge that the richest man in town was operating a germ warfare program a few miles away. Mona and her group broke into the lab. They deployed what the show describes as an antibiotic bomb, a device that destroyed the biological agent stored inside the facility. The raid was successful. The pathogen was neutralized. In the chaos of the operation, they accidentally cured the asthma of the facility's security guard, who turned out to be a young Clancy Wiggum, the man who would eventually become Springfield's chief of police. But Mona made one mistake. As the group fled, she stopped to help someone who had been knocked down in the confusion. That person was Mr. Burns. She stopped to help the man whose weapons she had just destroyed. Burns saw her face. He saw it clearly enough to identify her. He reported her to the FBI. And from that moment, Mona Simpson was a fugitive. She could not go home. She could not contact Abe. She could not hold Homer or tell him what was happening or explain why she was leaving. She kissed her son goodbye in the dark while he was sleeping, and she disappeared into a life lived underground, moving constantly, never settling, never safe. For 27 years. Homer woke up the next morning and his mother was gone. And Abe, rather than tell Homer the truth, gave him a grave. He pointed at a dead poet's headstone and said, "That is your mother." And Homer believed it because what was the alternative? Now, the conspiracy extends beyond the initial event. Burns did not simply identify Mona to the FBI and consider the matter closed. He pursued her. For decades. He maintained the pursuit as a personal priority. When Mona returns to Springfield in Season 7, when she and Homer finally have the reunion the episode builds toward, Burns recognizes her almost immediately after her return. He spots her through the window of a taxicab and calls the authorities. The FBI arrives at the Simpson house. Mona has to flee again. Homer has to say goodbye to his mother for the second time in his life, knowing now exactly why she is leaving and exactly who is responsible. And here is the piece that should sit uncomfortably for anyone who has thought about it. Homer knows. At the end of that episode, Homer knows. He knows that Burns is the man who forced his mother underground when Homer was a child, who maintained the pressure that kept her from ever being able to come home, who has spent decades ensuring that a woman whose only crime was destroying a biological weapons facility would never be safe in the town where her son lives. Homer knows all of this. He goes back to work on Monday. He does not confront Burns. He does not quit. He does not even seem to fully process the connection between his employer and the destruction of his family. This is not presented as a joke. It is presented as tragedy, because Homer Simpson is not capable of making connections like this. His brain does not work the way a brain needs to work to take a piece of information and follow it through to its logical conclusion. The crayon, the radiation, the decades of cognitive erosion from living inside Springfield's contaminated environment. Whatever the cause, the result is a man who has been handed the explanation for his own suffering and cannot hold it in his mind long enough to do anything with it. Burns engineered this, not in the sense of a master plan executed from the beginning, but in the sense of choices made and consequences allowed to accumulate until the accumulated consequences produced exactly the result that served Burns's interests. By driving Mona underground when Homer was young, Burns ensured that Homer would grow up without the parent whose presence might have counteracted what Springfield was doing to his cognitive development. He ensured that Homer would carry the psychological damage of maternal abandonment through his entire adult life. He ensured that Homer would become the specific kind of broken that makes a person stay in a bad situation because the alternative, being truly alone, feels worse than any job. Homer works at the power plant, not despite Burns having destroyed his family, but in some structural sense because of it. The man Burns needed in Sector 7G was not a competent nuclear technician. The man Burns needed was someone whose large quit, who would not organize, who would not sue, who would not look too carefully at the violations or think too seriously about what the waste was doing to the town's water supply. Someone compliant through damage rather than choice. Homer fits every specification. The show confirms the structural relationship in a later season when it is revealed that Grandpa Simpson struck a deal with Burns at some point in the past. Burns had committed a crime. Grandpa discovered it. In exchange for Grandpa's silence, Burns guaranteed Homer a job at the plant regardless of his performance. Not a good job, not advancement, not fair wages. Just the guarantee that Homer would always have a position, that he would never be permanently fired regardless of what he did or failed to do. 742 documented errors, and Homer has never been let go. Grandpa made a deal with the man who destroyed his family's life, in exchange for a guarantee that his son would always have a job at the facility responsible for the destruction. He traded the truth for employment security and called it protection. He gave Homer a job and took away any chance Homer might have had of understanding why his life felt the way it felt. 3 generations of Simpsons. Mona fought back and lost everything. Abe made a deal with the source of the damage and buried the evidence. Homer inherited the consequences and has no idea why. Burns, the man at the center of all 3 stories, runs a nuclear power plant on a hill at the edge of town, collects his billions, undergoes his weekly treatments, and employs the son of the woman he drove underground in 1969, without ever once acknowledging the connection. Mona died in a later season. The scene is one of the show's quietest. Homer sits beside her. He holds her hand. He watches the mother he barely knew slip away. There is no joke. There is no cutaway. There is no reset at the end of the act. Just a man and his mother, and the weight of 27 years that Burns stole from both of them, pressing down on one last afternoon together. The Simpsons is a comedy. It has always been a comedy. But underneath the comedy, underneath 36 seasons of Homer falling over and getting up, there is this story. A family broken by one man's willingness to use his power against people who could not defend themselves. A mother who spent her adult life in exile. A father who covered it up. A son who will never fully understand what was taken from him. And a billionaire who keeps the lights on in Springfield and who has never once been held accountable for any of it. Burns always wins. That is the show's honest position. Because in Springfield, the man with the money writes the rules. And the rules say Homer Simpson will work at the nuclear power plant until he dies, because his grandfather made a deal, because his mother made a choice, because the richest man in town needed a specific kind of broken man in Sector 7G, and Homer was broken before he ever clocked in for his first shift. Section 9. Where is Springfield? Springfield is the most famous fictional town in the history of American television. More people know its name than can identify the capital of a significant portion of the 50 states. It has a nuclear power plant. It has a tire fire that has been burning for decades. It has a gorge. It has a monorail that was sold to the town through fraud. It has a harbor, a mountain range, farmland, a desert within driving distance, an ocean coastline, a downtown area, residential neighborhoods, a theme park, a professional sports team, 2 hospitals, a prison, and a quick E-Mart. It has weather that ranges from blizzards to tropical heat events across the span of a single season. It borders, depending on which episode you are watching, Ohio, Nevada, Maine, and Kentucky, and it has been described as being located in the north, the south, the heartland, the coast, and near both the Canadian and Mexican borders. Springfield does not exist in any specific state. Springfield exists in all of them simultaneously, and the show has been deliberately maintaining this impossibility for 36 years with a consistency that goes beyond ordinary continuity errors. The contradictions are not accidental, they are architectural. Every time the show appears to narrow down the location, another episode appears that flatly contradicts the narrowing. Lisa's area code, glimpsed briefly in one episode, corresponds to a Missouri exchange. The state abbreviation visible in another episode is NT, which does not correspond to any real American state. A phone call Homer makes to the state capital connects to a voice that identifies the state as beginning with a vowel, which eliminates some possibilities while keeping dozens more viable. The clues accumulate and cancel each other out with a precision that feels intentional. Matt Groening, the show's creator, addressed the location question directly in a 2012 interview with Smithsonian Magazine. He said the name Springfield came from his own childhood proximity to Springfield, Oregon. He chose the name specifically because Springfield is one of the most common city names in America, appearing in dozens of states, which allowed the show to be set in a Springfield without committing to any specific Springfield. He confirmed that the original inspiration was Oregon, and for approximately 48 hours, the internet treated the mystery as solved. Springfield was in Oregon. Case closed. Except the show immediately continued contradicting this. Episodes aired after the interview that placed Springfield in geographic contexts inconsistent with Oregon. The writers did not honor Groening's disclosure. They kept the ambiguity alive, because the ambiguity was never an accident to be resolved. It was a design choice being maintained. The surface-level explanation for this is the one the show's creators have offered explicitly. Springfield is meant to be universal. It is designed to feel familiar to every viewer regardless of their actual location, to be the town you grew up in, whether you grew up in Maine or Mississippi or Arizona. Making Springfield placeless makes it everywhere. Making it unlocatable makes it available to the entire audience simultaneously, rather than belonging specifically to any one region's experience of American life. This is true. The design philosophy is real, and the writers have confirmed it. But it sits alongside another reading that is harder to dismiss once you have spent time with the other theories in this exploration. Consider the radiation theory. If Springfield is a contamination zone, if the laws of biology have been demonstrably altered by decades of nuclear exposure, if the people who live there display physical characteristics that do not appear in the uncontaminated population outside the town, why should geography be exempt from the contamination's effects? Biology is not the only system the radiation affects. If the cellular structure of living things in Springfield has been rearranged by proximity to the power plant, perhaps the physical landscape itself has been rearranged. Perhaps the contamination does not just affect organisms. Perhaps it affects space. Perhaps Springfield has both mountain ranges and ocean coastlines because the radiation warped the geography around the town the way it warped the genetics of its fish and its residents. The town is physically impossible for the same reason that Blinky had 3 eyes. The normal rules stopped applying. The coma theory offers a different answer that is perhaps even more satisfying. Homer's dreaming brain does not contain a precise cartographic representation of the United States. It contains fragments, impressions from a road trip once taken, the look of mountains seen through a car window, the smell of ocean air from a vacation that happened before 1993, the desert glimpsed in a movie, the flat agricultural nothing of driving through the Midwest. Pieces of every American landscape Homer Simpson ever encountered, assembled together without regard for geographic logic, because dreams are built on emotional logic rather than spatial reality. Springfield feels like everywhere because Homer's sleeping mind built it from everywhere he had ever been, layered on top of each other without the organizing principle of actual geography to keep the pieces separated. The coma dream does not know where Springfield is. It only knows what it felt like to be in places that contributed to the dream's construction, and so Springfield has whatever geographic features are needed for each particular dream. Mountains when the story needs mountains, ocean when the story needs ocean, a desert when the story needs a desert. The geography is responsive rather than fixed, serving the narrative rather than existing independently of it. The principle and the pauper theory offers a third reading that is more legally specific than either of the others, and in some ways the most practically unsettling. Springfield's geographic uncertainty is a protection. You cannot regulate a town you cannot locate. You cannot bring federal charges against a nuclear facility if the jurisdiction is perpetually undefined. You cannot hold anyone accountable for anything if the state the crime occurred in changes depending on which episode you are watching. Springfield floats between possible states because floating prevents landing, and landing means accountability. Landing means a fixed regulatory authority, a permanent EPA oversight office, a state attorney general with consistent jurisdiction who can investigate a nuclear plant with 342 safety violations and a history of dumping radioactive waste on school playgrounds. Springfield does not have a state because having a state would give someone with legal authority somewhere to stand when they came looking for answers about the three-eyed fish and the cracked cooling towers and the billionaire who was alive during the Gilded Age and seems to have no plans to stop. In the episode Behind the Laughter, the show's 12th season mockumentary, Springfield's location was finally revealed. In the original broadcast, the Simpson family was described as being from northern Kentucky. In syndicated reruns, the location was changed to a different state. The answer literally varies depending on which version of the episode you are watching. The show gave you a definitive answer and then changed the definitive answer. Even when Springfield has a location, that location is not stable. It shifts, it mutates. It refuses to settle the way everything else in Springfield refuses to settle. Every American state has been proposed as Springfield's location by some portion of the fan base. Every proposal has evidence supporting it. Every proposal has evidence contradicting it. The show sustains this state of permanent geographic ambiguity across 36 seasons, with a discipline that exceeds any reasonable explanation based on writer carelessness. The ambiguity is maintained because the ambiguity serves the show's central function. A town that belongs to everyone belongs to no one. A town that could be anywhere cannot be regulated from anywhere specific. A town without a fixed location on any map is a town that no map can shut down. Springfield will never be found. Not because the show cannot decide, but because the show decided long ago that the mystery is more valuable than the answer. Springfield is everywhere. That is the point. And everywhere cannot be fixed in place, pinned down, held to account, or exiled from its own story. Section 10. The Floating Timeline and the Loop We Built. Bart Simpson was 10 years old when The Simpsons debuted on the 17th of December, 1989. He is 10 years old right now. Lisa was 8. She is 8 now. Homer and Marge were in their mid-30s. They still are. Maggie was 1 year old and has remained 1 year old across every single episode of every single season of every single year since the show began. 36 years have passed in the real world. 0 years have passed in Springfield. The characters exist in a permanent present tense, frozen at the ages they were when the show premiered, living through decades of real-world cultural change without adding a single candle to their birthday cakes. The industry term for this is a floating timeline. The concept is that the show's present is always the audience's present. The year changes, the technology changes, the cultural references update to reflect whatever is currently happening in the world, but the characters do not age. They are locked at the ages they occupy, and the world moves around them while they stay still. This is a standard production approach for long-running animated series. It is how the Flintstones worked. It is how the Jetsons worked. It is how most animated shows that outlast their original cultural moment have been structured. No one is supposed to find it alarming. But The Simpsons has been running long enough that the floating timeline has created contradictions so significant and so structurally strange that they have started to undermine the premise that this is simply a production convention. The most visible example is Homer and Marge's origin story, okay? When the show began, their history was grounded in the late 1970s and early 1980s. They met in high school. They fell in love in the period of Watergate and disco and early punk and the anxious economic pessimism of the Carter years. Their courtship was set during a specific era, with era-appropriate music and fashion and cultural context, and that era corresponded naturally to the life history of people in their mid-30s in the late 1980s. Everything fit. The timeline was coherent, but the floating timeline dragged the present forward. If Homer and Marge are still in their mid-30s in 2025, then they did not meet in 1980. They met in approximately 2005. Their high school experience was not defined by Watergate and disco. It was defined by social media and early streaming and the cultural landscape of the 2000s. The show has acknowledged this. In later flashback episodes, Homer and Marge's youth has been rewritten to reflect the decade that would make sense for people their current apparent age. They were grunge fans. Then they were early internet users. Then they were millennials navigating the early years of the 2010s. Their origin story has been told and retold in at least 4 distinct versions, each one set in a different era, each one internally consistent with the floating present of its season, and internally inconsistent with every other version that came before. Homer and Marge do not have a fixed past. They have a sequence of approximations, drafts that get revised every few years to maintain the appearance of a coherent timeline while the actual timeline slides forward. Their memories are unstable. Their history is a working document rather than a settled record. And the show has normalized this so thoroughly that most viewers do not notice when the flashback they are watching contradicts the flashback they saw 3 seasons earlier. Every major theory we have discussed in this exploration arrives at this point from a different direction, and every one of them comes to the same conclusion. The coma theory. Nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen mind of a man who lost consciousness in April 1993. The world Homer knew on the day he went under is the world the dream preserves. His children are the ages they were when he last saw them. His wife looks the way she looked on the last morning he woke up beside her. The dream cannot age them because it cannot access a future Homer was not present for. The radiation theory, the mutations caused by decades of nuclear contamination, have altered the character's biology at the cellular level. Whatever process drives normal human aging has been disrupted or arrested. The residents of Springfield are not immune to damage, as Homer's injuries and Burns's medical requirements demonstrate, but they are immune to the specific biological clock that moves people through the stages of a human life. The contamination did not just change how they look, it changed how time moves through them. The principal and the pauper theory. Springfield resets because the town collectively chooses to reset, and part of what gets reset each time is the passage of time itself. The community's defense mechanism, its elaborate social contract of maintained denial, extends to age as well as event. Nobody in Springfield gets older because getting older would require acknowledging that time has been passing, and acknowledging that time has been passing would require acknowledging everything that time has brought with it. The Burns immortality theory. At least one person in Springfield has used extraordinary wealth to engineer freedom from the normal constraints of biological time. If Burns can extend his life past 100 years through medical intervention, if age can be managed like a chronic condition for someone with sufficient resources, then the concept of a fixed timeline is already compromised within the show's own universe. Time is negotiable in Springfield. The floating timeline is not a narrative convention. It is a natural consequence of a world where the rules about time were already broken before the show began. The show has imagined what aging would look like. It has done this multiple times with care and emotional precision. In Season 6, in an episode called Lisa's Wedding, the show flashes forward to depict Lisa as a 23-year-old woman, engaged to be married, navigating adult relationships with the intelligence and the loneliness and the idealism that 8-year-old Lisa already shows. The future the episode depicts is detailed and specific. Lisa has grown into the person the show has always suggested she would become. Thoughtful, principled, still slightly alienated from the world around her, still searching for the connection that eluded her in childhood. It is a beautiful, melancholy episode, and it proves, beyond any argument, that the show has the capacity to imagine its characters growing up. It chooses not to. The flash-forward lasts 1 episode. Lisa returns to being 8. Bart returns to being 10. The glimpsed future closes. The permanent present resumes as if the window had never opened. The show can imagine growth. It has demonstrated this. It simply refuses to allow it. The flash-forwards exist to show you what will never happen, the roads not taken, the futures that the floating timeline permanently defers. They are beautiful because they are impossible. They move you because they will never be real. This is where the floating timeline becomes something larger than a narrative device. The Simpsons is the American family. They have been the American family for longer than any comparable fictional household in the history of the medium. And the American family, as the show depicts it, is not allowed to change. Homer must remain mid-aged and impulsive, and fundamentally good underneath the disaster of his surface. Marge must remain patient in the particular way that patient people who are holding everything together against considerable odds are patient. Bart must remain rebellious. Lisa must remain idealistic and slightly isolated. Maggie must remain silent and potentially extraordinary. The dynamic must be preserved, the structure must hold. Because the moment The Simpsons ages, the moment Bart leaves for college and Lisa gets her own apartment and Maggie starts a sentence and Homer and Marge face an empty house on Evergreen Terrace, the show stops being a comedy. It becomes something else. An elegy for a version of American family life that the show has been preserving in amber since 1989, held at exactly the moment before everything changes, which is the moment just before it ends. America does not want that story. America wants the version where the kids are always young and the marriage is always solid enough to survive, and the house always looks the same, and the couch gag always plays, and nobody ever has to say goodbye. America wants to sit on the couch with Homer and Marge and the kids on Sunday nights and feel the specific comfort of things being the way they were. The familiar weight of a show that has been running since before most of its current audience was old enough to understand what it was. The floating timeline is the show's thesis statement, stripped of every joke and every gag and every clever satirical observation. We freeze The Simpsons because we need them frozen, because letting them age means letting time pass. Letting time pass means acknowledging that 36 years have gone by in the real world. Acknowledging that means facing the version of yourself who was watching this show as a child on that specific couch in that specific house that may no longer exist or may belong to someone else now. The couch is somewhere else. The childhood is gone. The version of you that first saw Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie is older than you sometimes want to think about. But as long as The Simpsons is on, as long as the loop keeps running, as long as Bart is still 10 and Homer still stumbles through the door at 5:30 after another shift at the plant, you do not have to fully acknowledge any of that. You can sit down and find them exactly where you left them, unchanged, waiting, the family that the passage of time cannot reach. The loop is not their prison. It is ours. We built it. We maintain it. We tune in every week to make sure the walls are still standing and the family is still there and the timeline is still safely floating. And every time we do, we make the loop a little tighter, make it a little harder for the story to move toward the ending that every story eventually requires. The Simpsons are frozen in time because we stopped time for them. We pressed pause in December 1989, and we have never pressed play. And here we are, 36 years later, watching the same family, in the same house, on the same street, in the same impossible town, waiting for something to change and knowing nothing will, because we will not allow it. Section 11. Hans Moleman, Ned Flanders, and the Quietest Tragedies in Springfield. There are two characters the show has been quietly destroying for 3 decades, and neither of them are the ones most people would guess. One is a tiny elderly man who cannot stop dying. The other is the nicest person in Springfield, and the nicest person in Springfield is the saddest one. Start with Hans Moleman, because his story is both funnier and stranger than it appears at first. If you have watched The Simpsons at any length, you know Hans Moleman. He is tiny, he is elderly, he is nearly blind. He wears thick glasses and a hearing aid and moves through the world with the particular resigned, shuffling gait of someone who has been beaten by circumstances so many times that being beaten has stopped surprising them. He appears in the background of Springfield scenes across hundreds of episodes, and his primary narrative function is to experience extreme misfortune. He gets hit by cars. He gets crushed by objects that fall from improbable heights. He gets buried alive. He gets eaten by animals. He gets struck by lightning. He gets incinerated. He walks into traffic with the calm certainty of a man who has either accepted his fate or cannot see well enough to avoid it. He falls into open manholes. He is carried off by birds, dropped from considerable heights, and subjected to forms of physical destruction that go well beyond what the most liberal reading of animated slapstick would normally accommodate. And by any conservative count, Hans Moleman dies on screen more times than any other character in the history of American animation. Not in Halloween specials, not in dream sequences. In regular, canonical episodes that are meant to depict what is actually happening in Springfield. Moleman dies, and then he appears in the next episode completely fine, with no explanation, no resurrection scene, no acknowledgement from any character that they were recently present for his funeral. He simply returns, ready to be destroyed again, in a cycle that the show treats as so mundane that it does not merit comment. Most people accept this as a running gag. Moleman dies a lot. It is a recurring bit. Do not think about it too carefully. But the theories provide a framework that makes Moleman's cycle strange in a different way than the comedy implies. Under the radiation theory, Moleman represents perhaps the most extreme mutation in Springfield. Where Homer's mutation reduced his intelligence and granted him unusual physical durability, Moleman's mutation did something genuinely unprecedented. It made death reversible. His biology has been so fundamentally altered by nuclear exposure that his body can reconstitute after fatal trauma in a way that nothing in observed biology should permit. He does not survive his deaths the way Homer survives injuries. Homer endures damage and heals. Moleman actually dies. His vital functions cease, and then he comes back. Death in Springfield is a temporary condition for certain residents, a biological reset triggered by whatever the power plant has done to their cellular architecture, and Moleman may be the purest expression of that mutation. The coma theory offers an interpretation that is colder. Moleman is a background process in Homer's dream. He is a minor character, a piece of environmental furniture that Homer's unconscious mind does not care enough about to maintain consistently. The dreaming brain that builds Springfield populates it with a cast of secondary characters whose continued existence is not emotionally important to Homer, and so their existence is less stable than the characters who matter. Moleman dies because Homer's dreaming brain occasionally drops him, the way a poorly maintained program loses data, and he comes back because the dream needs him to populate the next scene. He is not a person in this reading. He is an object that the dream reassembles when needed and forgets when it does not. Under the collective denial framework, Moleman's deaths are simply one more thing Springfield has agreed not to notice. A man dies in public, repeatedly, in front of witnesses, and nobody investigates. Nobody questions the mechanism. Nobody asks how he is standing in the checkout line at the grocery store when the entire town watched him get flattened by a steamroller the previous Tuesday. The town has normalized Moleman's death cycle the way it has normalized everything else that should be alarming, adding it to the long list of Springfield impossibilities that everyone has collectively decided to treat as background noise. And then there is the detail that sits in the show waiting to be found. In one canonical episode, Hans Moleman states his age as 31 years old. 31. Look at him. He appears to be in his 80s at the youngest. The distinction between his stated age and his apparent physical age is not the gap between a poorly aging man and a well-aging one. It is the gap between someone in the first third of a normal human life and someone in the final chapter of a very long one. If Moleman is telling the truth, and the show provides no indication that he is lying or confused, something aged him by the equivalent of 50 or 60 years, at a rate that no natural process can explain. Something took a man in his early 30s and transformed him into what he looks like now. Something that also made him nearly indestructible despite his apparent frailty. Something that made his death a revolving door rather than a permanent condition. The radiation theory has an answer for this. The coma theory has an answer. The collective denial theory has an answer. The only framework that does not have an answer is the one that says The Simpsons is just a cartoon, and none of it has a consistent internal logic worth examining. And given everything we have covered, that is the framework that requires the most faith to maintain. Now turn to Ned Flanders, because Ned's story is the one that stays with you after everything else is faded. On the surface, Ned Flanders is everything Homer Simpson is not, rendered in deliberate, almost mathematical contrast. He is kind where Homer is selfish. He is generous where Homer is petty. He is devout where Homer is indifferent to religion except when he needs something. He is physically fit where Homer is not. He is financially responsible where Homer is perpetually on the edge of some disaster he has created for himself. He is a good father. He is a good neighbor. He is, by any objective measure, a better person than Homer Simpson, in virtually every way the show provides for comparison, and he lives next door to Homer Simpson and has been doing so for 36 years. And the show punishes him for it, relentlessly. Ned's wife Maude was killed at a Springfield Speedway event when a t-shirt cannon misfired and sent t-shirts in the wrong direction. Homer was the cause. He was dodging the flying shirts, and his dodging redirected their path toward Maude, who was hit and knocked from the bleachers. Homer's selfishness killed Ned's wife. The causal chain is not ambiguous, and Ned forgave him, because Ned forgives. That is what Ned does. He absorbs the damage and responds with grace and patience and a faith that the pain has a purpose he cannot currently see. The show has explored what sustains that pattern, and the answer is not reassuring. In an episode centered on a hurricane that destroys Ned's house, the community attempts to rebuild it, but builds it so poorly that it collapses immediately. Ned snaps. He has a complete psychological breakdown, standing in the wreckage of his home and addressing each person in the crowd directly, saying the things he has been holding inside for years, every frustration and every resentment and every accumulated wound from decades of being the good one in a town that does not reward goodness. He is subsequently institutionalized, and during his time in the mental health facility, the show reveals what is actually underneath Ned's perpetual kindness. Ned was a violent and uncontrollable child. His parents, beatniks who did not believe in conventional discipline, took him to a psychiatrist who spent years implementing what amounts to behavioral reprogramming, conditioning the aggression out of Ned through intensive therapeutic intervention conducted when Ned was too young to consent to or understand what was being done to him. The therapy worked. The aggression was suppressed. The kindness that replaced it is not a natural character trait. It is the output of a behavioral modification program applied to a child without his knowledge. Ned's patience with Homer is not saintly. It is pathological. His brain was wired during childhood to suppress anger at all costs, and the cost of that suppression is a lifelong inability to protect himself from the people who take advantage of his programmed grace. His faith is not simply spiritual conviction. It is the framework he requires to explain why he keeps suffering when he follows every rule and honors every commitment and tries harder than anyone around him to be the person his community deserves. Without the faith, the explanation for Ned's life becomes unbearable. With it, there is still purpose somewhere in the pain, even if the purpose is not visible yet. And here is the detail that the show allows to sit without commentary, the one that accumulates its weight quietly across decades of episodes. God talks to Homer, multiple times. Homer has had direct face-to-face conversations with God within the show's canon. God has intervened in Homer's life, offered him guidance, spoken to him in dreams and visions with a directness that suggests genuine divine attention. Homer Simpson, who sleeps in church, who treats religion as something that happens on the periphery of his actual concerns, who converted to a snake-handling sect because it got him out of going to services, has a personal relationship with the divine that most characters would give everything to have. Ned has dedicated his life to faith. He attends services with genuine devotion. He prays with intention. He structures his entire existence around his religious commitments. He has given more to his faith than anyone else in Springfield, and he has never, in 36 seasons, had God speak directly to him. Not once. God talks to Homer. God ignores Ned. The drunk who falls asleep during services gets divine conversation. The devout man who organized his entire life around his belief in God gets silence. That is not random. That is the show stating something honest about how its universe is organized. Goodness is not rewarded in Springfield. Kindness is not protected. Moral seriousness is not answered. The system does not care about virtue. It cares about compliance and utility, and Ned is the most compliant person in town by design, shaped into compliance before he was old enough to choose it, and his reward is everything being taken from him by a universe that shows no sign of being organized around the principles he has devoted himself to. Homer and Ned are the show's two poles. Homer does everything wrong by conventional moral standards and is loved, protected, forgiven, and ultimately fine. Ned does everything right and loses his wife, his peace of mind, his sense of self, his trust that the goodness he performs has any relationship to what happens to him. They live next door to each other. They have been neighbors for 36 years, and the gap between them, the gap between the man who tries and the man who does not has never once closed. Because in Springfield, the gap does not close. The system is not designed to close it. The system is designed to keep Homer at the plant and Ned at the church and Burns at the top and Molman in the ground and everyone exactly where they have always been, in a loop that does not break, in a timeline that does not move, in a town that has no fixed location on any map. That is Springfield. That is everything we have been through tonight. Every theory and every mystery and every buried thread reduced to its simplest form. A town where nothing changes, where nobody grows, where time does not pass and consequences do not stick, where the same family sits on the same couch in the same house and watches the same television and lives the same life in a loop that started in 1989 and has shown no signs of ending. Let us spend a little more time with the physical evidence, because the show has provided more of it than a single pass through the episodes can capture. Consider the hair. Every person born in Springfield, every native resident of the contamination zone, has hair that behaves in ways that real human hair does not behave. Marge's tower extends straight upward and maintains its structure across decades without any visible evidence of the product or infrastructure that would be required to hold it in the real world. Bart's spikes maintain their formation independent of gravity, movement, or external interference. Lisa's hair forms geometric shapes with mathematical precision. Homer's fringe holds its position regardless of what Homer's head has recently been through, including explosions, impacts, and water submersion. Hair is composed of keratin, a protein whose structure is determined at the cellular level, and the structure of that protein in any individual is determined in part by genetics and in part by environmental factors. Environmental radiation is one of the most studied environmental influences on keratin production and hair follicle function. The atomic bomb survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki experienced documented changes in hair growth patterns among the documented biological effects of acute radiation exposure. Chronic low-level exposure over decades would produce different effects than acute high-level exposure, but the biological mechanism connecting radiation to hair structure is not theoretical. It is documented. Springfield's residents all have hair that grows in ways that differ from uncontaminated human populations. The contamination theory would predict exactly this. The show depicts it and calls it an art style choice, which it is, but art style choices and in-universe biological facts are not mutually exclusive categories. The art style of The Simpsons is yellow skin and 4 fingers and hair that defies gravity and eyes that protrude from the skull. And every one of those characteristics is also consistent with what you would expect from a population that has been living in a nuclear contamination zone for multiple generations. The 4-finger question deserves its own examination. Polydactyly, the presence of extra fingers or toes, is among the documented developmental abnormalities associated with radiation exposure. Oligodactyly, the absence of fingers, appears in the teratological literature as well. The specific presentation of 4 fingers rather than 5 is consistent with a digit formation anomaly that affects the entire population born and raised within the contamination zone. Every Springfield native has 4 fingers. Every visitor from outside has 5. The show has never in 36 years depicted a Springfield native with 5 fingers on each hand. The population within the contamination zone is uniformly affected. The population outside it is uniformly unaffected. This is not a coincidence. It is a pattern. The pattern is the evidence. The yellow skin is perhaps the most discussed visual element of the show and the one that gets explained away most reflexively as pure aesthetic choice. Matt Groening has described it as a way to catch a channel-surfing viewer's attention, to make the show immediately visually distinguishable from anything else on television. That explanation is true as a production history note, but the yellow skin within the show's universe is a characteristic shared by every Springfield resident and by nobody who enters Springfield from outside. The outsiders have skin that ranges across the spectrum of real human skin tones. The Springfield natives are uniformly yellow. Jaundice, the yellowing of skin caused by elevated bilirubin in the bloodstream, is one of the symptoms associated with liver dysfunction. Radiation exposure is documented to affect liver function. Chronic low-level radiation exposure over the lifespan of an entire population could, theoretically, produce a population-level shift in bilirubin metabolism that manifests as a generalized yellowing of the skin. The show does not suggest this directly, but the show does depict a population with uniformly yellow skin, and the contamination theory provides a biological mechanism for that observation: the eyes. Bulging, protruding eyes of the type every Springfield native displays are consistent with thyroid dysfunction, which is among the most well-documented consequences of radiation exposure in affected populations. The thyroid gland is highly sensitive to radioactive iodine, which is one of the isotopes released by nuclear reactor incidents and leaks. Thyroid disease produces, among other effects, proptosis, the forward displacement of the eyeball from the orbit that produces the bulging appearance. Thyroid dysfunction also affects metabolism, cognition, and physical development in ways that are consistent with several other characteristics the Springfield population displays. The cognitive effects deserve particular attention. Radiation's effect on brain development and cognitive function has been documented in populations affected by nuclear incidents, in the children of affected populations, and in populations living in contaminated environments over extended periods. The mechanisms involve both direct neurological damage and indirect effects through thyroid and hormonal dysfunction. A town that has been drinking water contaminated by a nuclear facility with 342 violations for multiple generations would, based on documented outcomes from real-world contamination events, be expected to show population-level cognitive effects. Homer's IQ of 55 is the most extreme example, amplified by the crayon. But Homer is not depicted as uniquely cognitively impaired within Springfield. The town as a whole demonstrates a consistent difficulty with the kind of abstract reasoning and long-term consequence assessment that would allow its residents to identify and respond to the source of their problems. They watch Blinky and forget about it. They watch Burns eat Blinky and consider the matter closed. They seal themselves under a dome, and by the next episode, the dome is gone, and the dome is never mentioned again. The cognitive pattern across the whole population is one of difficulty holding onto information that requires connecting current observations to longer-term causal chains. This is consistent with documented neurological effects of chronic radiation exposure. The inability to perform the specific type of extended causal reasoning required to recognize a contamination crisis and take collective action against its source is not a random character flaw distributed through Springfield. It is a population-level cognitive deficit that has a plausible explanation in the environmental conditions of the town. Burns is the control case. Burns demonstrates what a person with access to proper protection, proper treatment, and the resources to manage their own contamination exposure looks like when living in the same environment. He is cognitively sharp. He is capable of extended strategic reasoning and long-term planning. He is, by any measure, the most intellectually capable character in Springfield, and he has been managing his own radiation exposure with medical precision for over a century, which means the cognitive degradation that affects the rest of the town's population has not, to the same degree, affected him. He has been managing the thing that damages everyone else because he has the resources and the knowledge to do so. Everyone else in Springfield has been absorbing the damage unmanaged. The show has given you all of this. It is in the episodes, it is in the details. The three-eyed fish and the luminous rats and the skeletons in the basement and the violations and the dome. It has been sitting in the show since season 2, waiting for someone to look at it as a connected system rather than a collection of individual comedy elements. The radiation theory is not an imposition of pattern onto random material. It is the recognition of a pattern the show built and maintained across 36 years, delivered in the form of jokes and background details and one-off references that accumulate into something impossible to dismiss once you see them as a whole. Springfield is a contamination zone. Its residents are living evidence of what unchecked industrial contamination does to a human population over generations. And the show has been honest about this in the only form it could use, which is comedy, for as long as it has existed. There is a version of the coma theory that goes further than most discussions of it go, and it involves looking at the specific content of the dream rather than just its existence. If Homer's unconscious mind has been running a simulation of his family since April 1993, then the content of that simulation, the specific events and characters and scenarios it generates, tells us something about Homer's unconscious mind, about what he fears, about what he loves, about what he was unable to stop thinking about in the weeks before the vending machine fell on him. Consider Mr. Burns. In Homer's dream Springfield, the man responsible for his mother's exile is his employer. The man who destroyed his family is the man who signs his checks. The man with the most power over Homer's life is the man who did the most damage to it. This is not a coincidence of dream construction. This is Homer's unconscious mind placing the source of his deepest wound in the position of greatest ongoing threat. The dream does not protect Homer from Burns. It keeps Burns present, central, impossible to escape, because that is what unresolved trauma does. It keeps the threat alive in the place where it can still be felt. Burns can never remember Homer's name. This detail has been present since the earliest seasons and is played for comedy throughout the show. But in the coma theory framework, Burns's inability to remember Homer's name is the dream's expression of Homer's deepest fear about himself. That he is not memorable, not important, not the kind of person that significant people remember. The fear that his mother left because there was something about him that did not merit staying. Burns's chronic forgetting is the dream's translation of that fear into a recurring experience, placing Homer in a daily relationship with a version of the rejection his childhood trained him to expect. And yet Homer never leaves. He goes back every day. He endures the forgetting and the dismissal and the conditions and the violations and the man who destroyed his family. He goes back because leaving would mean being alone. The dream understands this too. It keeps Homer in the job that hurts him because the part of Homer's unconscious mind that is running this simulation knows that Homer would not leave. That his psychology, shaped by Mona's disappearance and the false grave and 27 years of unexplained absence, would keep him in the position of someone who stays in the thing that hurts him rather than face the vulnerability of leaving. The Marge element of the dream is where the love becomes most visible. Homer has made the same mistakes with Marge in dozens of episodes. He forgets anniversaries. He prioritizes himself over her. He makes decisions without consulting her. He behaves repeatedly in ways that should reasonably end a marriage, and the marriage endures. Not because the show is unrealistic about marital durability, because the dream will not let the marriage end. Homer's unconscious mind, dreaming about his family, cannot generate a version of the dream in which Marge stops loving him. It tries, occasionally. There are episodes that push toward genuine marital rupture, and every single time, the marriage survives. Because Homer's dream cannot imagine losing Marge any more than it can imagine his children growing up. She is too central to the thing he is fighting to preserve. Marge's hair in the dream is enormous and blue and impossible, and Homer loves it. In the dream's logic, Marge's hair is the thing that makes her Marge. It is the visual signature that Homer's unconscious mind has attached to the person he loves most. The identifying feature that says, "This is her. This is the one." Even in a dream where everything else is shifting and unstable, she remains identifiable. She remains herself. The dream keeps the hair because the hair is Homer's shorthand for Marge, the detail his unconscious mind holds onto most firmly. The children in the dream are preserved at the ages they were when Homer went under, which we have discussed. But the content of what each child represents in the dream is worth sitting with. Bart represents Homer's mischief, his rebelliousness, his unwillingness to be contained by authority. Homer dreams a son who does the things Homer wished he could do, who says no to everyone who deserves to be told no, who refuses to comply with a system that does not deserve compliance. Bart is Homer's fantasy of freedom, packaged in a 10-year-old who cannot be held fully accountable for his refusals. Lisa represents Homer's hope, his best aspiration. The version of his child who is smarter than the world she was born into, who sees things clearly, who will not accept the town's collective agreement to ignore what is true. Lisa in the dream is the thing Homer loves most to be around and understands least. Genuine intelligence that is not compromised by the damage that has compromised his own. She is the person in the family who is equipped to see what Springfield actually is. And the dream keeps her there, keeps her trying, keeps her failing to fix things that are too broken to be fixed by one child, because Homer cannot dream a version of his family where the person trying to make things better gives up. Maggie is love without language. The purest distillation of what it feels like to have a baby in your life, to hold someone small and essential and entirely dependent on you, before language complicates the relationship, and before the years add distance and independence, and the ordinary drift that happens between parents and children as children grow. Maggie in the dream is everything Homer cannot let go of. The early years, the smallness, the warmth of something that small and that dependent being entirely yours. She does not grow because growing would mean losing that specific version of what she is. The dream keeps her 1-year-old because 1-year-old is the form in which Homer held her and felt the completeness of it. The dream is a love story. Not a perfect one, not an easy one, but underneath every strange adventure and impossible celebrity guest and escalating absurdity of the later seasons, there is a man in a hospital bed dreaming about his family because they are the only thing his sleeping mind will not release. He keeps them exactly as they were. He keeps the world turning around them. He keeps himself in the middle of it, stumbling and failing and getting back up because in the dream he is still there. Still in the house, still part of it. Still their father, their husband, their coworker, their neighbor. Still alive in the only way that matters to him. There is an aspect of the Burns shooting mystery that most analyses gloss over in favor of the more accessible questions about who held the gun. The question of who benefited from the official answer. Maggie being named as the shooter ended the investigation. Chief Wiggum closed the case and, in his own words, there is nothing to be done because no jury would convict a baby. The investigation dispersed. The resources dedicated to it were redirected. The Springfield Police Department, never an organization of exceptional capability, moved on to other concerns. The case was closed not because it was solved, but because the solution chosen was one that could not be prosecuted. Now ask who had the most to gain from the investigation ending quickly. Burns himself is the obvious candidate, and under certain readings of the evidence he is also the most plausible architect of the resolution. Burns woke from his coma with a bullet wound and a hospital room full of people waiting to hear what he remembered. He identified Maggie. He described an encounter in the parking lot that the show did not depict in real time during the first episode. He provided an account of events that nobody could independently verify or contradict, because the only other person present for the account was a 1-year-old infant who could not speak. Burns's testimony was taken largely at face value by a police investigation that was already struggling and was apparently relieved to have an answer, any answer, that would allow the case to close. Burns had every reason to provide an answer that would close the investigation. An ongoing investigation into who shot Mr. Burns was an investigation that might eventually produce evidence about why someone shot Mr. Burns, which was a question with answers that Burns would prefer to keep unasked. The conditions at the plant, the violations, the contamination. The reason so many people in Springfield had genuine motives for the shooting was that Burns had done genuine damage to Springfield, and an investigation that ran long enough and carefully enough might document that damage in ways that served interests other than Burns's. Naming Maggie cut through all of that. It gave the investigation an answer. It gave the police department a reason to stop. It prevented any further examination of the circumstances that produced such a crowded field of suspects in the first place. And it could not result in any prosecution, which meant the case would remain permanently closed, rather than producing a trial that would require public examination of Burns's conduct. Whether or not Burns fired the shot himself, the outcome he identified served his interests precisely. Whether he protected someone he cared about, as the Marge theory suggests, or manufactured an answer that was convenient for him, the effect was the same. The investigation stopped. The reasons people had for wanting Burns dead did not become the subject of public legal proceedings. The plant continued operating. Springfield continued drinking the water. There is also the question of Homer's fingerprints on the weapon. The show establishes that Homer's fingerprints were found on Burns's gun and that this was a significant piece of evidence against Homer before Burns's identification of Maggie changed the direction of the investigation. Homer's fingerprints on the gun would require Homer to have handled the gun at some point on the night of the shooting. The gun was missing from Burns's holster before the shooting occurred. If Homer handled the gun, he either found it before the shooting or took it from Burns at some point during the confrontation. If Homer fired the gun and then left it where it could be found by someone else, someone very small and very low to the ground, someone who would then pick it up and be holding it when Burns fell against the sundial, the entire chain of physical evidence fits without requiring Maggie to be the shooter. Homer fired. Maggie found the gun afterward. Homer's fingerprints are on it because Homer used it. Maggie's fingerprints are on it because she picked it up after. The eyelash that tested as belonging to a Simpson could have come from either of them, and the DNA test, which identified the eyelash as coming from a Simpson rather than a specific Simpson, was interpreted to implicate Homer but does not exclude the possibility that the eyelash came from Homer rather than Maggie. Burns's identification of Maggie, delivered from a coma recovery bed with whatever cognitive clarity that state permits, directed the investigation away from Homer and toward the baby. The investigation followed the direction. The case closed. And Homer went back to work at the power plant owned by the man whose mother Homer may have attempted to murder. The show acknowledges this possibility in season 18 when Homer says he shot Burns. The show acknowledges the Marge possibility through the structure of the evidence and the Smithers alternate ending. The show acknowledges the inadequacy of the official answer through the sundial detail, through the contest that nobody won, through the DVD commentary in which the writers describe a process of choosing an answer and building the clues around it, rather than building clues that led to an answer. The greatest mystery in The Simpsons was never solved. It was managed. And the management of it tells you more about how Springfield operates than the solution ever could have. Burns's immortality is inseparable from Burns's empire, because the empire is both the means of his survival and the thing his survival is designed to protect. Understanding what the empire actually is and how far it extends helps explain why Springfield cannot effectively challenge it. The Springfield nuclear power plant is the visible component. The facility on the hill with the cracked cooling towers and the 342 violations is the piece that everyone in Springfield can see and name and theoretically point to when describing their relationship to Burns. But the plant is a single element in an infrastructure that the show has gradually revealed as extending through essentially every major institution in Springfield. The town's hospital. The show has depicted Springfield General Hospital in dozens of episodes, and across those depictions it emerges as an institution with unusual priorities. Its doctors are frequently depicted as indifferent, poorly qualified, or motivated by considerations that are not entirely patient-centered. The show plays this for comedy. The contamination theory reads it as a systemic feature rather than a collection of individual character failings. If Burns's influence extends into Springfield's healthcare infrastructure, if the doctors who operate within that system have learned that certain findings are more welcome than others, and certain diagnoses generate consequences that nobody in the system wants to deal with, then the medical establishment's failure to identify the contamination's effects in the patients it treats makes functional sense. The town's government, Mayor Quimby, Springfield's endlessly corrupt mayor, has been depicted across dozens of episodes as someone whose decision-making is available to whoever can afford to influence it. Burns has the resources to afford it. The show does not always make this connection explicit, but it establishes clearly that Springfield's civic government is not insulated from the interests of the town's wealthiest resident. Regulatory decisions, zoning approvals, responses to contamination complaints, the degree of aggressiveness with which public health standards are enforced, all of these are subject to the influence of whoever has the most leverage over the people making the decisions. The town's media, the Springfield Shopper, the town's newspaper, appears in enough episodes to suggest a consistent relationship between the paper's coverage and the interests it is careful not to threaten. The Three-Eyed Fish, when it became a story, did not produce sustained investigative journalism about the power plant's contamination practices. It produced a campaign talking point and a televised fish eating, and then the story ended. A media environment that was genuinely independent of Burns's influence would not have let the story end there. It would have pursued the obvious follow-up questions about the water supply and the contamination levels and the violations and the cost of remediation. Those stories did not get written. Springfield's legal system. The show has depicted Judge Snyder and the Springfield court system across numerous episodes, and the principal and the pauper, which we have already spent significant time with, demonstrates the degree to which the legal system's operation can be redirected by collective preference, and the preferences of whoever has the influence to shape collective preference. A legal system that can issue a decree making it illegal to mention a demonstrably true fact is a legal system that has already subordinated the function of law to the function of power. And in Springfield, power lives in the same building with the cracked cooling towers. The show has never fully mapped the extent of Burns's reach through Springfield's institutions, but it has provided enough fragments that the picture, assembled, is one of a town whose ostensibly independent institutions are united by a common dependency on the continued goodwill of the person who owns their power supply. The hospital receives Burns's philanthropic contributions and does not investigate contamination-related illnesses too aggressively. The mayor receives Burns's support and does not pursue regulatory enforcement of the plant's violations. The newspaper receives Burns's advertising revenue and does not devote sustained attention to stories that would disturb a major advertiser. The legal system operates within the general culture of a community that has decided, through the mechanism depicted in The Principal and the Pauper, that certain truths are too dangerous to enforce. Burns built this, not through a single decision or a deliberate conspiracy, but through the accumulated influence of a century of wealth and the consistent application of that wealth toward the goal of maintaining control. He did not need to explicitly corrupt each institution. He needed to be wealthy enough and present long enough that each institution developed, on its own, a learned sense of which directions it was safe to face and which directions it was not. The result is a town that cannot meaningfully challenge its primary polluter because every mechanism that would normally enable that challenge has been shaped through dependency and influence and the accumulated weight of a century of decisions to operate in ways that serve Burns's interests rather than the interests of the people those mechanisms were designed to protect. This is why the contamination has continued for 36 seasons without resolution. Not because nobody in Springfield has noticed the three-eyed fish, because every institution that could act on the three-eyed fish has reasons not to. The hospital does not diagnose the contamination's effects aggressively. The government does not enforce the violations. The media does not sustain the story. The legal system does not pursue the accountability. And Burns continues to glow and continue and keep the lights on, powered by the same force that is slowly taking the light out of everyone around him. The Principal and the Pauper tells you something that extends past Springfield and past The Simpsons. It tells you something true about the communities that most people actually grow up in. The show is satire. It always has been. The specific kind of satire that works by presenting something true in an exaggerated form and watching the audience laugh at the exaggeration, hopefully uncomfortable enough to recognize what they are laughing at. Springfield's collective vote to sustain a lie is an exaggeration of a real mechanism. The exile of the truth-teller is an exaggeration of a real pattern. The legal decree making a demonstrated truth criminal is an exaggeration of a real social function that communities perform constantly and informally, without the formality of Judge Snyder's decree, but with equivalent practical effect. Real communities do not vote formally to maintain comfortable lies. They do it through the mechanisms available to real communities, which are social rather than legal. The person who insists on the truth that the community has agreed to ignore stops receiving invitations. The business that pursues a story the powerful people in town want unpursued finds its advertising revenue dries up. The official who enforces the regulations that the major employer has been violating finds that the next election goes differently than expected. The family that asks too many questions about the contamination in the water finds that the other families in the neighborhood are less warm than they were. These are not isolated behaviors. These are systemic patterns that appear in communities that have a significant power concentration in a single employer or institution, and that have organized their economic and social lives around the continued goodwill of that employer or institution. Company towns, resource extraction communities, towns built around military bases or major government facilities. The dynamics that The Principal and the Pauper depicts in explicit, comedic, legally formalized form appear in these real communities in implicit, serious, socially enforced form. Springfield is a company town. It was built around the plant and it runs on the plant, and everyone inside it, consciously or not, has calibrated their behavior to the requirements of staying in the town that the plant sustains. The Tamzarian story is the company town's approach to inconvenient truth, scaled up to narrative dimensions and presented with the straightforward honesty that satire permits. This is what the management of uncomfortable information looks like. This is what happens to the people who carry uncomfortable information into communities that have decided they cannot afford to receive it. The real Seymour Skinner was not a bad person. He was not a disruptive person. He was simply true, and truth in that context was disruptive enough. He had done nothing wrong. He arrived with documentation of a demonstrably false official narrative and presented it in a public forum. That was enough. The community's response was not to examine the evidence. It was to remove the person whose presence made the evidence difficult to ignore. The show's writers knew they were saying something uncomfortable with that episode. They knew it would be unpopular. Harry Shearer's public criticism, the fan backlash, the decades of ranking it among the worst episodes, all of this was predictable, and the writers did it anyway. Because the episode is saying something the comfortable episodes cannot say. It is showing you the mechanism that allows everything else in Springfield to work the way it works. It is pulling back the curtain on the reset and showing you what is behind it. Sometimes the most important thing the art does is the thing the audience wants to return. Every character in The Simpsons has a defined relationship with the future. Homer's future is bounded by his present. He cannot plan far enough ahead to reach a future that looks different from the present he is in. Burns's future is an extension of his past, the same empire maintained across a longer and longer span of time. Lisa's future is the one she is constantly trying to build against the resistance of a world that does not want to be built into. Bart's future is something he has not yet decided to think about. Maggie's future is the only one the show has never sketched. Not in flash forwards, not in hypotheticals, not in the sustained projection of current characteristics into adult life that the show has done for Lisa multiple times. The show knows what adult Lisa looks like. It has shown you. It has never shown you adult Maggie. It has never told you what 36 years of observation and accumulated intelligence and strategic invisibility are building toward. It has given you the accumulation and withheld the application. This is not accidental. The show withholds Maggie's future because revealing it would require committing to something about what she is. And what she is, based on everything the show has provided, is something the show cannot fully commit to depicting in a Sunday night animated comedy format without the premise breaking under the weight of it. Consider what the evidence suggests. A child with off-the-scale intelligence. A child who has been watching every adult in her environment for 36 years, cataloging their behaviors, their weaknesses, their patterns, their relationships with each other, the systems they operate within, and the gaps between what the systems are supposed to do and what they actually do. A child who has demonstrated, repeatedly and in contexts that required operational precision, the ability to act effectively and invisibly without detection in spaces where detection would have consequences. A child who has chosen silence not because she cannot speak, but because speaking would change her relationship to information, and information, held rather than shared, is the most significant form of power available to someone in her position. Maggie has 36 years of research. She has been doing it since before she could walk. She knows where Burns is vulnerable. She knows what the plant has done to her family. She knows what the contamination is. She knows the mechanism of the collective denial because she has watched it operate repeatedly in real time. She knows who Armin Tamzarian is. She knows who shot Burns, if it was not her. She knows about the deal between Abe and Burns. She knows about Mona, because Maggie was alive when Mona came back and Maggie pays attention to everything. The question of what she plans to do with all of this has no canonical answer. The show has never told us, but it has given us enough to understand that Maggie is the one character in Springfield who has both the intelligence to understand what Springfield is and the discipline to have been accumulating the information and the operational experience to do something about it for 36 years. She is waiting for the right moment, or she has already been doing something about it, quietly, below the level where Springfield pays attention, and the results will only become visible when she decides to let them be visible. The most dangerous operative in Springfield is the one who appears most helpless. The most equipped person in the family is the one everyone treats as a prop. And the person most capable of bringing down the entire architecture that Burns has built is the one nobody has thought to protect it against. Maggie Simpson is 1 year old. She cannot walk reliably. She cannot form sentences. She has never once been taken seriously by anyone in Springfield in any sustained way. She is the most dangerous person in town. There is a broader argument lurking behind the prediction phenomenon that deserves its own space because it connects The Simpsons to a question about the relationship between fiction and reality that goes past any single episode or prediction. The show began in 1989. It premiered at the end of a decade that had established, with considerable confidence, certain foundational assumptions about how American life was organized. The Cold War was ending. The economy had spent the decade in a particular relationship with ordinary working people. The middle class occupied a specific position in the cultural imagination. The nuclear family, despite all the evidence of its actual fragility, remained the dominant aspirational structure. The Simpsons, from its very first episodes, was a satire of those assumptions, not a rejection of them, a satire. It loved the nuclear family while showing you all the ways the nuclear family was held together by anxiety and habit and the absence of better options. It loved the middle class while showing you the specific financial precarity that made middle-class life a constant exercise in staying exactly one disaster away from a different kind of life. It loved American optimism while depicting, with affection and precision, all the ways that optimism produces a willful blindness to conditions that optimism is not equipped to address. The show was describing something true about America in 1989, and America in 1989 was America in 1995, America in 2000, America in 2010, America in 2025. The specific details changed, the technologies changed, the names and the events and the cultural references changed. But the structural conditions that the show was describing in 1989 are structural conditions that have not been resolved in the intervening decades. The power concentration, the corporate capture of civic institutions, the working class's inability to organize effectively against the interests that shape their conditions, the replacement of genuine political engagement with the performance of it, the media's relationship to the institutions that fund it. When The Simpsons depicts a working-class family whose primary employer is also the dominant force in every institutional structure that is supposed to hold that employer accountable, it is describing something that is true about American capitalism and has been true about American capitalism across the entire span of the show's run. When it depicts a government official who is available to the highest bidder, it is not making a prediction about future corruption. It is describing a pattern of corruption that was already established when the show started and has not been disrupted since. The predictions that seem most uncanny are not predictions at all. They are the show's core observations about structural conditions proving, in each subsequent decade, that structural conditions persist. Trump's presidency was not predicted. The conditions that made it possible were described accurately in 1989 and have been described accurately in every subsequent year. When those conditions produced the outcome they were always capable of producing, the show's description of the conditions looked like a prediction of the outcome. But the prediction was never about Trump. It was about the thing that produces Trumps, which was already present and is still present, and will keep producing results consistent with its continued presence. The Simpsons predicts the future the way any sufficiently accurate description of structural conditions predicts the outcomes those conditions generate. It is not prophecy. It is understanding. And the reason the understanding keeps looking prophetic is that the conditions it describes have not been changed. The three-eyed fish is still in the water, Springfield is still drinking it, and the plant is still running, exactly as it has always been, producing exactly the outcomes you would expect from a facility with 342 violations and a safety inspector with an IQ of 55. The show did not predict America's trajectory. It described America's conditions, and the conditions kept producing. The show just kept writing it down. Abe Simpson is the most underexamined character in the show's central family, and what he knew about Burns and what he did with that knowledge is the connective tissue between Mona's story and Homer's. The deal between Abe and Burns, the one that guaranteed Homer's employment in exchange for Abe's silence about something Burns had done, is referenced in the show but never fully developed. The show gives you the fact of the deal without the full context of what Burns had done that Abe discovered. There are enough fragments to make some deductions, but the show leaves the central fact deliberately underspecified. What we know, Burns committed something Abe felt was significant enough to be leverageable. Abe chose to leverage it not for justice, not for public accountability, not for the remediation of whatever damage Burns had done, but for a personal benefit for his son. Homer would have a job. That was the exchange. A guaranteed position at the facility responsible for the environmental destruction of the town he lived in exchange for Abe's permanent silence about whatever Burns had done. Abe made a deal with the devil and called it protecting his son. He gave Burns permission to continue, in exchange for the guarantee that the person most damaged by Burns's continuation would always have a place within the thing damaging him. Homer's job security is not a coincidence. It is not Burns being generous or forgetful or incidentally benign. It is the product of a negotiation that Abe conducted without Homer's knowledge, over something Homer was never told about, in service of a protection that Homer did not know he needed, and that did not protect him from the things that actually damaged him. The false grave is part of this. Abe knew Mona was alive. Abe knew Burns had forced her underground. Abe knew that the FBI was looking for her because Burns had reported her. And Abe, rather than tell Homer the truth, pointed him at a poet's headstone and said, "This is your mother." He gave Homer a lie that would shape his entire psychological development, and he made that choice presumably because the truth was too complicated to explain, or because the truth was too dangerous for Homer to carry given Burns's continued pursuit of Mona, or because Abe simply did not have the emotional capacity to have the conversation the truth required. Abe's complicity in Homer's psychological damage is not incidental. It is foundational. Homer's mother did not die. Homer's mother was driven underground by Homer's employer. Homer's grandfather knew both of these things and told Homer neither. And when Homer finally discovered the truth in season 7, Abe's response was not to explain the deal he had made with Burns. It was not to tell Homer the full extent of what he had hidden and why. The episode ends without Homer knowing about the Abe-Burns arrangement, without Homer knowing that his guaranteed employment was purchased with the price of his own understanding of his life. 3 generations of Simpson men, each one making a choice that limited the next one's options. Abe chose silence. Homer had no choice available to him because silence was the only information he was given. And Maggie, who has been watching all of this accumulate, is the first generation of Simpson who has had access to the full picture and the cognitive capacity to hold it whole. What Maggie does with it is the open question. What Abe did with it was bury it. What Homer does with it is forget it by Monday. What Maggie does with it is 36 years into the show's run, the one mystery that has not been foreclosed. The geographic impossibility of Springfield is not just interesting as a production design choice or as a theoretical implication of the other theories. It is interesting as a map of the denial itself, because denial, in communities that practice it well, tends to have geographic as well as social and legal dimensions. The community that does not want to be found does not want to be located, not just by investigators or regulators, but by the community's own members when they try to locate themselves within a larger context. If Springfield residents cannot place their town on a map, cannot identify with certainty which state they live in, cannot refer to a clear regulatory framework that governs their situation, they cannot effectively advocate for themselves within systems that would require them to do so. You cannot contact your state attorney general if you are not certain which state you are in. You cannot file with the EPA regional office if you are not certain which region applies to you. You cannot vote in a gubernatorial election with specific impact if the governor's jurisdiction over your situation is ambiguous. Springfield's geographic ambiguity is not just the legal shield we discussed earlier. It is an internal disorientation that compounds the cognitive effects of the contamination. A population that cannot locate itself geographically cannot effectively engage with the political and regulatory structures that would normally provide some check on the behavior of a major industrial polluter. They are not just cognitively impaired by the contamination. They are geographically unmoored in ways that make it difficult to navigate any external system that might provide relief. This is not accidental. Burns benefits from a population that cannot effectively engage with external systems. The geographic ambiguity, like the cognitive impairment, like the institutional capture we discussed earlier, is part of an ecosystem of conditions that maintains Burns's control over Springfield by limiting the town's capacity to access the resources that would be required to challenge him. The show builds this ecosystem piece by piece, episode by episode, across 3 decades, and never draws a line connecting all the pieces. It leaves the connection for the audience to make, in the full confidence that the Springfield residents themselves never will. There is a final thing worth saying about The Simpsons before we let the theories rest. Something about what keeps the show running and why. The show has been on for 36 years. It has been declared over, dead, past its prime, in irreversible decline, for at least 20 of those years. Critics have written the obituary. The internet has cataloged the decline. The fans who grew up with the golden era episodes have spent decades mourning the loss of what it once was. And the show keeps going, every Sunday night. New episodes, new couch gags, The family's still there, Bart's still 10, Homer's still stumbling home. The show keeps going because the loop we built to contain it has no designated endpoint. We built a loop that would run forever, and then we stepped inside it and forgot that we built it. The love for the show and the protection of the show have become the same thing, and the thing being protected is not just a television program. It is the specific feeling of a specific moment in American cultural life when a cartoon family on a Sunday night felt like the truest depiction of the life being lived around it. That moment was real. The early Simpsons was extraordinary. It did what the best satire does. It made the familiar strange enough to examine and the strange familiar enough to love. It showed you the dysfunction and the love at the same time. The cracks in the foundation and the warmth in the walls, the ways the system worked against the people inside it, and the specific human stubbornness of those people in continuing to live and love and try anyway. The theories exist because people wanted to hold on to that extraordinary early version of the show as they watched it change. They wanted an explanation for the change that preserved the coherence of the whole, that let them keep all 36 years rather than having to divide the show into the good years and the years after the good years. The coma theory in particular is motivated by this desire. If Homer went into a coma in 1993 and everything since has been a dream, then the show has not declined. It has deepened. The increasing surreality is not the output of lazy writing. It is the output of a deteriorating mind generating increasingly unstable dreams. Whether or not the theory is true in any literal sense is almost beside the point. What it provides is a framework that allows a person to watch the entire show and find a coherent emotional story running through all of it. A man who loved his family so much that he built an entire imaginary world to hold them in and kept it running for 3 decades and never once let it end in a way that meant losing them. That is The Simpsons. However you choose to watch it, the theories are how we love a show that is too complicated to love simply. The mysteries are the evidence that 36 years of careful watching has produced. And Springfield, impossible and contaminated and unlocatable and frozen in time, is still there, still running, still providing the specific comfort of finding something exactly where you left it. Close your eyes. Let the story settle. Springfield will be here tomorrow. It always is. That is the whole point. There is one scene in the entire run of The Simpsons that most clearly articulates the physical impossibility of Mr. Burns, and it does not come from a dramatic moment or a carefully constructed mystery. It comes from a doctor's office, delivered with the dry professionalism of someone who has clearly been at this job long enough to stop being surprised by anything. Burns visits a physician for a checkup, and the physician runs through the results with the gravity of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis to an entire medical textbook. Every known disease, he explains. Burns has contracted every single disease documented in the medical literature. Every one of them, simultaneously, operating inside his body at this exact moment. Not sequentially, not in stages. All of them at once. Tuberculosis and polio and lupus, and every other illness that has ever been categorized and named and studied. Burns has them all. The doctor does not stop there, because the diagnosis has a twist. These diseases are all present simultaneously, and because they are all present simultaneously, they have entered a state of perfect biological equilibrium. Every illness is being blocked from progressing by every other illness. They are, in the doctor's analogy, like 3 people trying to walk through a doorway at the same time. None of them can move. The gridlock is total. Burns is, technically, the sickest man in the United States. And because he is the sickest man in the United States, he is functionally indestructible, because nothing that is trying to kill him can gain any ground. This scene is played for laughs. It is one of the most quoted moments in the entire show. But if you accept the premise of the radiation theory, if you understand that Burns has been managing his own relationship to radiation for over a century through a precise weekly medical protocol, then the Three Stooges syndrome is not a joke diagnosis. It is a description of what controlled, sustained radiation management does to a biological system over an extremely long period. The treatments Burns undergoes are not curing his diseases. They are not designed to cure them. Curing them would require dismantling an equilibrium that is currently the only thing keeping Burns functional. The treatments are maintaining the balance. Precisely calibrated doses of radiation, administered on a weekly schedule with zero tolerance for deviation, keeping every illness in his body at exactly the level required to prevent any other illness from gaining dominance. It is not medicine in any conventional therapeutic sense. It is nuclear management. Burns's body is a reactor, and Smithers is the technician who makes sure the control rods are always properly positioned. This is why Smithers's role in Burns's life cannot be reduced to loyalty or devotion, or even the complicated feelings the show depicts him as having. Smithers is keeping Burns alive in the most literal possible sense. Without Smithers managing the treatment schedule, without someone who knows the exact protocol, the exact dosage, the exact timing that keeps the disease equilibrium from collapsing, Burns would miss a treatment. The balance would fail. Every disease in his body would surge forward simultaneously. The Three Stooges would all get through the door at once. Burns has built his entire survival infrastructure around one person's competence and commitment. That is both his greatest vulnerability and the reason he has never, despite decades of evidence that Smithers is capable of independent action and judgment, ever seriously threatened to replace him. Burns fires people constantly. He fires Homer multiple times per season. He fires executives, assistants, security personnel, scientists, but he never fires Smithers for long. And when he does, the consequences for Burns are immediate and visible. His physical condition deteriorates. His clarity diminishes. The machine starts failing without its primary technician. Smithers knows this. The show has shown you that Smithers knows this. And the knowledge is the foundation beneath everything else in their relationship. Smithers stays because he believes in Burns. He also stays because leaving Burns would kill Burns. And whatever Smithers feels about everything else in his life, he cannot make peace with being the person who let that happen. Burns's connection to historical events provides the third layer of his impossible longevity. The show has placed him in proximity to an almost absurd span of American history. He attended Yale. He served in some capacity during World War II, in a role the show suggests was morally flexible at best. He knew Howard Hughes personally. He has referenced the Gilded Age not as something he learned about from books, but as something he lived through, as an era whose values and aesthetics shaped him before he was fully formed. He has described interactions with historical figures who died before most of the show's writing staff were born, in the casual, referential tone of someone accessing recent memory rather than distant history. The Burns family itself is depicted as one of the oldest and most continuously powerful lineages in American history. Not merely wealthy in the way that recent fortunes are wealthy, but wealthy in the way that predates the systems that normally regulate wealth, wealthy in the way that built infrastructure before infrastructure was publicly regulated and has been collecting revenue from that infrastructure ever since. The Burns dynasty did not rise through a single generation's genius or effort. It compounded over centuries, and the current Burns inherited both the fortune and the methods that preserved it. The question the show leaves deliberately unanswered is whether Charles Montgomery Burns is the first member of his family to extend his lifespan through artificial means, or whether the Burns dynasty has always found ways to maintain its hold on power across generational spans that should not be possible through normal succession. If the current Burns has been alive for over a century, through a combination of radiation management and extraordinary wealth, what did his predecessors use when the available technology was different? The show does not answer this. It only establishes that the Burnses have been in uninterrupted control of their fortune for longer than most American institutions have existed, and that kind of continuity does not happen through luck or normal inheritance. Burns's relationship to death is worth examining separately from his relationship to survival, because the show has depicted both sides of it in ways that illuminate each other. Burns has come closer to dying than almost any recurring character on the show. He has been shot. He has been hospitalized more times than any character other than Homer. He has collapsed, been attacked, been abandoned in the wilderness, without resources, been exposed to conditions that would end anyone without his particular combination of medical support and wealth-backed resilience. And every time, he comes back. Not through the cartoon physics that keep Homer alive. Homer survives things because the show needs Homer to survive, and the rules of the show's universe are flexible enough to accommodate that need. Burns survives because he has spent a century building the infrastructure required to ensure that nothing that happens to his physical body can outpace his access to the resources needed to address it. There is always a physician. There is always a treatment facility. There is always someone standing by with the specific knowledge and the specific tools required to bring him back from wherever the latest crisis has taken him. Homer's survival is passive. It is the product of cartoon logic and narrative necessity. Burns's survival is engineered. Every investment he has ever made, every institution he has ever influenced, every relationship he has ever cultivated from a position of wealth and power, all of it serves, at the most fundamental level, the goal of keeping Burns alive. He is not building an empire, he is building a life support system. The empire is the mechanism, the life is the point. And Springfield pays for it. Every electricity bill, every compromised regulatory inspection, every cognitive effect of the contaminated water, every physical mutation visible in the population that lives downwind, all of it is the cost of Burns's survival, distributed across the population he relies on to keep the system running. They pay with their health and their clarity and their children's development, and in exchange they get the electricity that Burns has made certain they have no alternative source for. Springfield cannot kill Burns, because Springfield cannot survive without him. And Burns cannot die because dying would require the system he built to finally answer for what it has done. The loop is closed and self-sustaining, and it has been running for over a century, and there is no mechanism within Springfield capable of breaking it. He is not immortal. He is something more durable than immortal. He is too expensive to die. The Principal and the Pauper is not just an episode about a man with a false identity. It is the show's most explicit statement about the mechanics by which Springfield maintains its impossible continuity across 3.5 decades. Think about what actually happens in that episode, step by step, because the steps matter more than the conclusion. A man arrives in Springfield with documentation. He has evidence. He has a name, a history, a military record, and the lived experience of being the person whose identity is currently occupied by someone else. He presents this evidence in a public forum. Multiple witnesses are present. The evidence is examined. The truth is verified. The truth is accepted. Everyone in the room acknowledges, in real time, that the person they have known as Seymour Skinner for 20 years is not Seymour Skinner. And then the town votes on what to do with this information. They do not debate the evidence. They do not question the verification process. They do not ask what the appropriate legal or ethical response to this discovery should be. They vote on whether to acknowledge the truth at all, whether the fact of Armin Tamzarian's false identity should be recognized within the community's shared understanding of itself, or whether the community should simply decide that the truth is inconvenient and the lie is preferable and act accordingly. The verdict is unanimous. The lie is preferable. Judge Snyder issues a legal decree. The imposter is officially designated as the real Skinner. The real Skinner, the man who survived a prisoner of war camp and came home to find his life stolen, is physically removed from Springfield, tied to a railway car and expelled from the community. And the decree makes it explicitly illegal for anyone to mention the truth again, under penalty of torture. Not under penalty of a fine, under penalty of torture. What the episode shows you is not an aberration. It shows you the operating system. Springfield has been running this same process across its entire history. The scale and formality of the Principal and the Pauper version are unusual. Normally it happens without the vote, without the decree, without anyone making the mechanism visible. The dome from the Simpsons movie disappears between episodes and nobody mentions it again. The nuclear near misses are forgotten by the following week. Characters who have died come back without explanation. Catastrophes that should permanently reshape the town's reality leave no visible mark. This has always been explained, within the fan discourse, as a production choice. Episodic storytelling. The reset button. Cartoon logic. The show does not carry consequences forward because carrying consequences forward would require more continuity than a weekly animated sitcom can maintain across hundreds of episodes. But The Principal and the Pauper offers a different explanation. The reset is not a production convenience. The reset is a civic process. Springfield resets between episodes because Springfield, as a community, chooses to reset. It does what it did in that episode except without making it formal. It votes informally, through the shared, unspoken agreement of people who understand what the alternative costs, to forget whatever happened, to treat the previous episode as if it did not occur, to maintain the agreed-upon version of reality regardless of what actually took place. The coma theory has its own explanation for the reset. Homer's dreaming brain runs each episode as a discrete simulation and resets between them because that is how dreams work, without accumulated continuity across cycles. The radiation theory explains the reset as a cognitive effect, the population's chemically compromised memory function, preventing the retention of information about events that connect to the source of their damage. These explanations are not incompatible with the collective denial theory. A population whose memory is impaired by contamination is more susceptible to the social pressure to forget. A dreaming mind that generates Springfield as its theater of operations would generate a Springfield whose amnesia is baked in, because that is the kind of Springfield the dream requires. All three explanations point to the same functional reality. Springfield forgets because forgetting is the condition of Springfield's continued existence. What happens if Springfield remembers? If the dome goes into the official record and stays there, if the three-eyed fish produces a sustained investigation, if the violations become a sustained public accountability effort, the entire infrastructure of the town begins to crack. The power plant, which is the economic engine of the community, would have to close or remediate at enormous cost. Burns, who is the owner of the plant and the primary employer of Springfield's working population, would face consequences he has never faced. The interdependency that keeps Springfield functioning as a community would be revealed as a trap that the community has been paying into for decades. Remembering is more dangerous than forgetting. The town knows this without articulating it. The social contract that produces the reset is maintained not through coercion alone, but through the genuine shared understanding that the truth, followed to its logical end, dissolves the only stability available to the people living inside it. They forget because they have to. They exile the truth-tellers because truth-tellers threaten the stability that is worth more to them than the truth. The real Seymour Skinner was not wrong. He was just incompatible with the community's survival strategy. And the community's response to incompatibility has always been the same. Remove the incompatible element. Expel the messenger. Tie them to a train and send them somewhere the truth they carry cannot reach back to disturb the comfortable lie. That is the infrastructure of Springfield's impossible continuity. Not cartoon logic, not lazy writing. A community that has collectively and consistently chosen the version of reality that allows it to continue existing over the version of reality that is true but survivable only for the people with enough resources to survive the consequences. Burns can afford the truth. The rest of Springfield cannot. So, the rest of Springfield forgets. There is a specific detail in The Longest Daycare, the Academy Award-nominated short film starring Maggie, that most discussions of her intelligence skip past without examining closely enough. During the film, Maggie is working through the logic of her situation, figuring out how to protect the caterpillar from the bully and from the daycare staff who will confiscate it if they discover it. She surveys the facility. She observes the patterns of the staff's movements. She identifies the windows, the exits, the structural features of the space. And she does this not once, as a single reconnaissance pass, but continuously, updating her model of the environment as new information becomes available, recalculating the optimal approach based on changing conditions. This is not infant behavior. This is operational planning. It requires holding a goal in sustained attention while simultaneously monitoring multiple variables, adapting when conditions change, and executing a multi-step sequence without losing track of where each step fits in the larger sequence. Cognitive scientists call this working memory, and the working memory demands of what Maggie is doing in that film exceed what most adults demonstrate in their daily lives, let alone what any one-year-old human brain has ever been observed to be capable of. The film plays this as charming. It is charming. It is also, if you hold it against the background of everything else we know about Maggie, a demonstration of capabilities that should be impossible. And the show has been consistent about this across its entire run. When Maggie is given a problem to solve, she solves it. When Maggie is placed in a dangerous situation, she navigates it. When Maggie is tested, formally or informally, the results suggest cognitive function that cannot be explained by normal developmental benchmarks. The IQ test sequence from one of the show's earlier seasons depicts Maggie being assessed and producing results that go beyond the capacity of the test to measure. The tester stops the evaluation, unable to find an appropriate ceiling for what Maggie is demonstrating. This is played as a quick sight gag. Look at the baby with the high IQ score. Funny. But within the show's established framework, it is another data point in a pattern that the show has been building across 3 decades without ever explicitly connecting its own dots. Maggie is extraordinarily intelligent. This is not ambiguous. It is not the result of a single episode's comedic premise. It is a consistent characteristic demonstrated repeatedly across different types of challenges, in different contexts, by different creative teams working on the show across its entire run. The writers of the early seasons who established the character and the writers of the recent seasons who continue her story have all, independently, kept arriving at the same place. Maggie is the most cognitively capable member of the Simpson family by a margin that cannot be overstated, and she does not speak. Not in the sense of being delayed, or of having a speech impediment, or of lacking the neurological equipment. Elizabeth Taylor voiced her saying "Daddy" in a moment, the show treated as meaningful precisely because of how rare it was. The show has since depicted Maggie making sounds that suggest she has opinions, preferences, amusements, frustrations. She communicates all of this through facial expression and gesture and the specific quality of her pacifier sounds. She understands everything said around her. She responds to context in ways that demonstrate comprehension. She is choosing not to produce language. The choice is deliberate. Consider what language would cost her. Language would make her visible. Language would produce expectations. Language would invite comparisons with Bart and Lisa, both of whom have been talking since before Maggie was born, neither of whom has found that talking made things better for them in any sustained way. Bart talks constantly and receives punishment for most of what he says. Lisa talks constantly and receives dismissal for most of what she says. The household is loud with the words of people who are not being listened to. Maggie has been watching this her entire life. She has been watching her sister, the most genuinely intelligent person in the family, use language as her primary instrument of engagement with the world, and receive from the world a response that ranges from indifference to active opposition. Lisa says true things and the world says no. Lisa identifies problems and the world declines to solve them. Lisa is brilliant and verbal and present in every conversation, and 36 years into the show's run, the situation she spends her time trying to fix has not materially improved. Maggie drew a different conclusion from the same evidence. Visibility is a liability. Language makes you visible, silence makes you invisible, and invisibility makes you capable. The less they are looking at you, the more you can do without interference. Every remarkable thing Maggie has accomplished in the show has happened because nobody was paying close enough attention to the baby to stop it. She shot a billionaire. The investigation focused on every adult in Springfield before arriving at her, because the category of baby is not a category in which investigators think to search for suspects. She organized and led a daycare rebellion against an authoritarian caretaker. The daycare staff did not detect the organizing because they were not monitoring the infants closely enough to observe the logistics being worked out. She has saved her family from threats that adult members of the family missed multiple times, without attracting the kind of sustained attention that would require her to explain herself. The strategy works because Springfield has a consistent blind spot for whatever is small and quiet and presented as helpless. The town is extraordinarily attentive to whatever is loud. Homer's disasters get attention. Bart's pranks get attention. Lisa's crusades get attention, even when the attention takes the form of opposition. The things that make noise are the things Springfield tracks. Maggie makes no noise. She is, by design, the thing Springfield does not track. And what she has accumulated in that space, behind 3 decades of strategic silence, is a complete picture of Springfield. She knows what the plant is doing to the water. She knows the history of her own family well enough to understand the connections between Burns and Mona and Homer and the deal Abe made. She knows who is complicit and who is oblivious and what the difference is. She knows what the collective denial looks like from inside it because she has been observing it operate since she was born, unimpaired by the cognitive effects that prevent the adults around her from seeing what she sees. Maggie Simpson is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. In that time, she has been building something. The show has never told us what it is, but the accumulation of evidence across 3 decades points toward a person who has been preparing, with extraordinary patience and extraordinary intelligence, for something the show has not yet depicted. When she decides to act, Springfield will not see it coming. She has spent her entire life making sure of that. Al Jean's explanation for the predictions, the dart-throwing analogy, is correct as far as it goes. With nearly 800 episodes across 36 years, statistical probability alone guarantees a substantial number of coincidences between the show's satirical premises and subsequent real-world events. This is mathematically true, and it is the right first answer to give when someone asks how the show keeps predicting things. But the dart-throwing explanation accounts for volume without accounting for precision. And it is the precision of specific predictions that makes them unsettling even after you understand the mechanism. The Trump escalator descent is the clearest case. The 2000 episode did not simply suggest that a famous businessperson with political ambitions might one day seek the presidency. It depicted Trump by name. It used a visual that mirrored with specific accuracy the aesthetic of Trump's 2015 announcement, including the escalator descent that became one of the defining images of that campaign. The show depicted not just the category of celebrity politician, but the specific visual language that the specific celebrity politician would use 15 years later. That level of specificity is not accounted for by volume alone. The Siegfried and Roy episode is similar. The show did not simply make a joke about dangerous animal acts. It depicted with specific visual detail a white tiger attacking one of its trainers. The real attack that injured Roy Horn in 2003 involved a white tiger and was specifically a tiger-on-trainer incident. The joke was about the specific type of animal attack, the specific configuration of the act, in a way that goes further than general trend extrapolation. Bill Oakley's explanation, that history repeats itself and the episodes are old enough that cycles of repetition make them look prescient, is also correct, and it addresses something that the dart-throwing explanation underplays. The show is satirizing structural conditions, not random events, and structural conditions recur. The conditions that produced one set of outcomes in 1995 produce comparable outcomes in 2005 and 2015 and 2025, because structural conditions are not resolved by individual events. The same dynamics keep producing the same types of results in the same types of situations, and a show that accurately describes the dynamics will keep looking like it is predicting the results. But the most interesting dimension of the prediction phenomenon is the one that neither explanation fully captures, which is the show's cultural influence on the events it appears to predict. The Simpsons has been embedded in American culture for longer than most Americans have been adults. Its images, its language, its characters, its satirical framings of American institutions have been part of the cultural environment within which American political and social life has developed across a generation. When the show depicts something as an inevitable comedic outcome of existing conditions, it does not merely describe that outcome. It inserts the description into the cultural bloodstream of a society that will eventually produce or fail to produce that outcome. People who grew up watching The Simpsons have the show's framings inside their heads when they make decisions. When a politician considers a move that resembles something Burns has done, the Burns comparison is available to anyone in their circle who watches the show. When a corporate consolidation happens that the show depicted as an obvious satirical premise, the framing of the show is already present in the cultural memory of the journalists and commentators who will cover it. The show does not predict events. It pre-frames them. It establishes in advance the satirical vocabulary through which events will be understood and described. When Disney acquired Fox, the reaction was not simply recognition that a large corporation had acquired another large corporation. The reaction was filtered through the show's prior depiction of that exact outcome, which meant the acquisition felt like a joke completing itself, an absurdist premise arriving in reality, a thing the show had already processed culturally before reality got around to producing it. That pre-processing changes the emotional texture of the event. It makes the shocking feel anticipated. It converts genuine surprise into a kind of resigned familiarity. The show has been doing this for 3.5 decades. It has been processing American social and political dynamics through the lens of satire, converting them into narrative form, and distributing them back into the culture in ways that shape how people think about those dynamics. Springfield is not America, but America has been marinated in Springfield's version of America for long enough that the two are no longer cleanly separable. The show's nuclear power plant, its corrupt billionaire, its incompetent government, its population that keeps choosing comfort over truth, are not only satirical observations about America, they are part of the cultural vocabulary through which Americans understand themselves. When the internet says The Simpsons predicted something, it is partially right. The show did not predict the event. It predicted the conditions that produce events of that type. It distributed that prediction into the culture at large, and then the culture, saturated with the show's framings, arrived at an event that the show had already made familiar. The recognition is real. The prophecy is cultural rather than prophetic, and the mechanism is more interesting and more unsettling than any conspiracy about writers with time machines. The story the show tells explicitly about Mona Simpson is the story of a woman who chose activism over safety and paid for it with decades of exile from her own family. That story is true as far as it goes, but there is a layer beneath it that the show provides in fragments and never quite assembles into the full picture it implies. Burns did not simply report Mona to the FBI because he was angry about the antibiotic bomb. Burns pursued her actively for decades. He maintained the pursuit across the entire span of time that Mona spent in hiding. He did not file a complaint and let the authorities handle it. He kept track of her. He kept the pressure on. When she surfaced in Springfield in Season 7, he spotted her through a window from a moving vehicle after 27 years of absence, and his recognition was immediate. Think about what that requires. Burns had been keeping Mona Simpson in his active awareness for over a quarter century, not as a dormant file, as a living concern, something he checked on, something he maintained resources around, something he did not allow to become a settled matter. Why? She destroyed a biological weapons laboratory. The weapons were gone. The damage to his operation, whatever it was, had been done. The practical reason to pursue her evaporated when the lab was destroyed. What remained was personal. Burns does not forget personal offenses. The show has established this consistently and completely. He remembers grievances across decades. He maintains positions of opposition toward people who wronged him in ways that have long since ceased to have any strategic purpose. The pursuit of Mona Simpson is the most extreme example, but it fits the pattern. Burns saw her face at the moment of the raid. She was going to get away. She stopped to help someone who had been knocked down, and that someone was Burns, and she chose to help him even while fleeing. And he looked at her face and memorized it, and spent the next 27 years ensuring she could not come home. It is a crime of recognition. She saw him in a vulnerable moment. She helped him in a vulnerable moment. He could not allow that to stand unaddressed. Now think about what the pursuit cost Homer. Mona was not simply absent from Homer's life. She was absent because Burns would not allow her to be present. Every year of Homer's childhood that passed without a mother was a year that passed because of Burns. Every developmental gap, every attachment wound, every pattern of desperation and approval-seeking and terror of abandonment that the show depicts as foundational to Homer's personality, all of it traces back to the decision Burns made on the night of the laboratory raid. Homer works for Burns. He has worked for Burns for his entire adult life, for wages that keep his family marginally above the financial line they would fall below without the job, in conditions that are poisoning him and his family, doing a job for which he is catastrophically unqualified, for a man who has never once remembered his name. And the reason this is Homer's life, the reason this specific arrangement is what Homer's adult existence amounts to, is that Burns drove Homer's mother underground when Homer was 6 years old and shaped, through that single act of sustained cruelty, the psychological profile of a man incapable of leaving. Abe's deal compounds this. When Abe discovered whatever it was he discovered about Burns, his first instinct was not to expose it. His first instinct was to leverage it for a personal benefit, which was the guarantee that Homer would always have a job. He traded his silence for his son's employment security, and he did it without asking Homer, without informing Homer, without giving Homer any of the information that would have allowed Homer to understand his own situation. The deal is an act of love that is also an act of profound limitation. Abe wanted to protect Homer. The protection he chose was a guaranteed position inside the thing that was damaging Homer, secured through an agreement with the person responsible for the damage, maintained through a silence that ensured Homer would never understand what had been done to him or why. Homer's job security is not a gift. It is a cage that Abe built with the best possible intentions, in a negotiation with the worst possible party, and it has held Homer in place for his entire adult life. The show confirmed in a later season that the arrangement between Abe and Burns included the guarantee of Homer's employment, regardless of performance, regardless of the number and severity of his mistakes, regardless of any normal standard by which employment would be terminated. 742 documented errors, each one sufficient for dismissal under any normal employment relationship. Homer survives them all because the deal says he survives them all. And Homer does not know any of this. He does not know about the deal. He does not know about Mona's full history with Burns. He does not know that his guaranteed employment is the cost of Abe's silence. He does not connect the billionaire who can never remember his name with the billionaire who forced his mother underground when he was a child, even though these are the same person, and the evidence is available to him from the season he discovers Mona is alive onward. Homer cannot make this connection. His brain, compromised by the crayon and by the radiation and by the cumulative effect of decades inside the facility that is the source of everything, does not have the cognitive architecture required to follow the thread from one end to the other. He feels the weight of his life without understanding its architecture. He knows something is heavy without being able to identify what is pressing down on him. That is Burns's most complete victory. Not the plant, not the wealth, not the immortality. The fact that the person most damaged by his decisions is the person least equipped to understand the source of the damage, living inside the damage every day, working for the person who caused it, grateful for the job. There is a geographic concept called terra incognita, which is the Latin phrase for territory unknown. Medieval cartographers used it to label the parts of their maps where knowledge ran out, where the documented world ended and the undocumented world began. They sometimes filled these spaces with monsters, with sea serpents and strange creatures, not because they believed the monsters were literally there, but because the blank space needed to communicate something. Here is where our certainty ends. Here is the edge of what we know. Springfield exists in a permanent state of terra incognita. It has been placed, over 36 years of episodes, in geographic contexts that are mutually exclusive. It has mountains to the north and coastline to the south and desert to the east and farmland to the west, and all of these features are accessible within a reasonable driving distance, which is not possible in any real American state. The weather shifts between blizzard conditions and tropical heat waves in ways that no real climate system could accommodate. The town is in the north and also in the south, near Canada and also near Mexico, in a coastal state and also in a landlocked state, depending entirely on which episode is currently playing. Matt Groening has said Springfield is based on Springfield, Oregon, where he grew up. This is the closest thing to a canonical answer the show has produced, and it lasted approximately 2 days before the show continued contradicting it. Episodes aired after Groening's admission placed Springfield in geographic contexts that were incompatible with Oregon. The writers did not honor the creator's confession. The mystery reasserted itself. This is because the mystery is functional. A Springfield that could be located on a specific state map would have a specific state's regulatory authority, a specific EPA regional office, a specific attorney general, a specific set of state-level environmental protections that would theoretically apply to the nuclear facility with 342 violations. A Springfield that cannot be located on any map has none of these things. Its regulatory situation is as ambiguous as its geography. You cannot file a complaint with an authority you cannot identify. You cannot organize political pressure against a representative whose district you cannot confirm you live in. The geographic ambiguity is a legal shield, but it is also a psychological one. A community that cannot place itself on a map cannot easily refer its situation to any external frame of reference. It cannot say other towns have dealt with this and here is how they did it, because it cannot identify comparable towns or the states they are in or the regulatory processes that applied. It cannot access a body of precedent because it cannot confirm it falls under the jurisdiction of any body that has established precedent. Springfield floats, and floating cuts it off from every anchor a community might use to pull itself out of a crisis. The coma theory turns this geographic ambiguity into something beautiful in its sadness. A dreaming mind does not have a precise map. Homer did not memorize the specific location of every American state before he went under. He had feelings about places, impressions, the memory of a vacation somewhere with mountains, the memory of a television commercial that showed a coastline, the memory of driving through flat farmland as a child, and the specific quality of light over that particular landscape. His dreaming mind assembled Springfield from these fragments, layered one on top of another, producing a town that feels emotionally true even though it is geographically impossible. Because dreams do not have geographic logic, they have emotional logic. Places in dreams are placed where they need to be to feel the way they need to feel, regardless of where they would actually be on a physical map. Springfield is in every part of America because Homer's memory of America is assembled from emotional associations rather than geographic accuracy, and the dream builds the place from the memory rather than from the territory. There is also the matter of the show's final possible Springfield location, delivered in the Season 12 mockumentary Behind the Laughter. The episode is a fake documentary about the Simpson family as a real television dynasty, complete with talking head interviews and a narrator describing their rise and fall. Springfield's location is given a definitive answer. It is in northern Kentucky, and then, in syndicated reruns of the same episode, the location was changed. The answer the show gave, the definitive canonical answer to the question the show spent 12 years dodging, was revised in reruns to a different state. Even the answer is not the answer. Even when Springfield commits to being somewhere, that somewhere renegotiates itself without announcement. The truth about where Springfield is keeps shifting to prevent the truth about where Springfield is from being final. A town without a fixed location has no fixed accountability. Springfield will never be found. Not because the show has not decided, but because the show decided long ago that being unfindable was more useful than any specific location could ever be. There is a paradox built into the structure of the floating timeline that rarely gets discussed directly. The Simpsons is, by any measure, the most temporally extended fictional universe in the history of American television. 36 years of continuous narrative, maintained with enough internal consistency that characters and relationships remain recognizable across the entire span, while simultaneously being maintained with enough flexibility that none of the continuity actually accumulates into permanent change. It is both the longest and the most static story ever told on American television. More time has passed, in the sense of calendar years elapsed, than in any other narrative. And less has changed, in the sense of character development and permanent consequence, than in almost any other narrative. The paradox is the point. The floating timeline is normally discussed as a production convenience, a way to keep the show contemporary without aging its characters. That is true, and it is the right description of the mechanism. But the mechanism produces something that goes beyond convenience. It produces a narrative that is specifically about the impossibility of change within a system designed to prevent it. Bart has wanted to not be in the 4th grade for 36 years. Not in a dramatic, stated way, but structurally, through the ongoing fact of never advancing past the grade he was in when the show started. He is perpetually on the edge of adolescence without ever crossing it. He is permanently at the stage of childhood where rebellion is the dominant mode and consequences are things that happen and are then forgotten. He is frozen at the exact moment of maximum mischief and minimum accountability, and the show cannot let him move forward because moving forward means becoming something other than Bart. Lisa has been trying to improve Springfield for 36 years. Her methods have changed, her targets have shifted, her emotional sophistication has grown, but the fundamental activity has not changed. She is still the person who sees what is wrong and tries to fix it and encounters resistance from a community that does not want to be fixed. The show cannot let her succeed in any lasting way because lasting success would dissolve the premise. It cannot let her give up because giving up would betray what she is. So she keeps trying, permanently, in a present tense that never becomes a past. This is what the show is saying about certain types of intelligence and certain types of effort within certain types of systems. Lisa's effort is genuine. Lisa's analysis is correct. Lisa's proposed solutions are, within the logic of the show's universe, generally reasonable, and they do not work. Not because Lisa is wrong, but because the system she is trying to improve is designed, at its deepest structural level, to resist the specific type of improvement Lisa represents. Lisa cannot fix Springfield, because Springfield is organized around the conditions that make Springfield need fixing. The contamination is the power plant. The power plant is Burns. Burns is the economy. The economy is the thing everyone in Springfield depends on. To fix what is wrong with Springfield, you would have to dismantle the thing that makes Springfield functional, and the people of Springfield, cognitively compromised by the very contamination they need to address, cannot make that trade. They cannot choose the pain of the short term for the healing of the long term. They keep choosing the fog. The floating timeline, understood this way, is not a production convenience at all. It is the show's most honest statement about the relationship between effort and systemic change. Lisa keeps trying and things keep not changing, not because the writers have run out of ideas, but because the show is depicting accurately what happens when a person of genuine intelligence and genuine integrity operates within a system specifically organized to neutralize both. The show imagined a future for Lisa. Season 6's Lisa's Wedding is a flash forward to a Lisa who has grown up, moved to England, gotten engaged to a man who appreciates her intelligence, built a life that looks, from certain angles, like the life her gifts always suggested she deserved. It is one of the most emotionally precise episodes the show has ever produced, because it shows you what Lisa could be if the show ever let time pass. And then it closes the window. Lisa returns to being 8. The future disappears. The permanent present reassumes control. The show can imagine growth. It refuses to depict it permanently, because permanently depicting growth would mean admitting that time has passed, which would mean admitting that the loop has been broken, which would mean admitting that the show is no longer the thing it was when it started. And the show cannot admit that, because the show is built on the premise that it is still what it was, that Springfield is still the place it was, that the family is still the family it was, that the couch is still where you left it, and the couch gag is still funny, and Homer is still stumbling through the door at 5:30 after another day at the plant. The loop is not their prison. It is ours. We built it because we needed it. We maintain it every time we watch. Ned Flanders has lost more than anyone in Springfield. This is not a metaphor. It is a scoreboard. His wife Maud died because Homer was being selfish at a sporting event, and the projectile meant for Homer hit Maud instead. His house was destroyed by a natural disaster and rebuilt by his neighbors in a way so carelessly done that it collapsed immediately on inspection. His father was a beatnik who did not believe in discipline, and Ned spent his childhood as an uncontrollable child until a psychiatrist conditioned the aggression out of him through a sustained behavioral modification program that rewired his entire personality. His relationship with God, the relationship that is supposed to be the foundation of everything he is and everything he does, has never produced the direct divine communication that Homer receives casually and repeatedly. God talks to Homer. God has not spoken to Ned. Think about what that means within the show's theological framework. The Simpsons has confirmed, through multiple episodes across different seasons, that God exists within the show's universe. God has appeared. God has spoken. God has had direct, interactive conversations with Homer Simpson, a man who falls asleep in church, who treats prayer as a negotiating tactic rather than a spiritual practice, who by any conventional religious metric is the least devout and least morally consistent character in Springfield. God finds Homer engaging enough to maintain ongoing contact with. God finds Ned, the most genuinely devout character in the show's history, sufficiently unremarkable that the divine attention has never once turned his way. The show is saying something specific with this. It is not saying God does not exist. It is not saying faith is unrewarded. It is saying that the specific way Ned expresses faith, through rule following and behavioral conformity, and the relentless suppression of every impulse that does not fit the moral framework he was given, does not produce the kind of relationship with the divine that Homer's chaotic, impulsive, frequently sinful but completely authentic engagement does. Homer is honest with God in a way Ned cannot be. When Homer argues with God, he is having a real argument. When Homer asks for things, he is making a genuine request, not a properly formatted petition. When Homer ignores God's preferences, he is exercising a real preference of his own, not performing the theater of free will in a context where the outcome has already been decided by what the religious framework requires. Homer's relationship with God is a real relationship, difficult and inconsistent and sometimes embarrassing, exactly like Homer's relationships with everyone else. Ned's relationship with God is a performance. It is maintained with extraordinary discipline and genuine effort and sincere intention, and it is still a performance because Ned's entire behavioral repertoire is a performance built on top of the rage that was conditioned out of him in childhood. The niceness is not natural. The patience is not natural. The forgiveness is not natural. They are the outputs of a system that was installed in Ned's psychology by someone else, without his consent, before he was old enough to choose. When the house falls down and Ned snaps and screams at the town, what comes out of him is not just frustration at a specific event. It is decades of suppressed responses to decades of specific injustices, finally breaking through the conditioning that has been holding them down. The things he says are things he has thought many times and never been able to express, because the programming says he cannot express them. And when the programming fails for a moment and the thoughts surface, the show sends him to a psychiatric facility where the programming is repaired. Ned is recommitted to not feeling what he actually feels, because what he actually feels is incompatible with the person everyone in Springfield needs him to be: the good neighbor, the patient sufferer, the living argument that goodness is possible and that it is worth practicing regardless of outcome. Springfield needs Ned to be what he is because Ned functions as a kind of moral counterweight to Homer. If Homer is the show's argument that a person can be chaotic, selfish, irresponsible, and fundamentally lovable all at once, then Ned is the show's argument that a person can do everything right and receive nothing for it and still keep doing it. Together, they bracket the space that most human behavior actually occupies. Between Homer's impulsive warmth and Ned's disciplined goodness, the show covers most of what people actually are. But the show is not equally kind to both sides of this equation. Homer's way of being in the world is rewarded with the thing Homer wants most, which is his family's continued presence and love. Ned's way of being in the world is rewarded with loss after loss after loss, and a God who talks to everyone except the person most desperately trying to deserve the conversation. Hans Moleman, meanwhile, dies every few weeks and comes back without explanation, and nobody in Springfield registers this as unusual. He stated his age as 31 in an episode where he appeared to be decades older than that, which, within the radiation theory framework, is a data point about what the contamination does to a person's biological age at an accelerated rate. He is the smallest recurring character, the most invisible, the one whose suffering is most routine and least acknowledged. He is the show's background reminder that ordinary suffering, the kind that is not dramatic and not attached to a recognizable character arc, is happening continuously and mostly unwitnessed in Springfield. He comes back from each death not because the show has established a resurrection mechanism for him, but because the show needs him there. He is Springfield's canary that cannot die, the indicator species for a contaminated environment, reappearing in the background to signal that conditions remain exactly as bad as they were. Springfield is a town where the good suffer proportionally to their goodness, and the irresponsible are protected by their obliviousness, where the honest are expelled and the liars are given legal protection, where the contaminated water flows unchanged and the cracked towers still stand, and the family at the center of it all watches television on a couch in a house that has survived everything because the dream will not let it fall. Every theory in this conversation arrives at the same place. Something is fundamentally wrong in Springfield. The causes differ depending on which theory you follow: radiation, or coma, or collective denial, or the engineering of an immortal billionaire, or some combination of all four working together to produce something no single cause could generate alone. But the effects are consistent across every explanation. The loop runs. The timeline floats. The family stays. Nobody ages. The plant keeps leaking. And the show keeps going, because the show knows something that the characters inside it will never be allowed to know. This is the only version of their world that is possible for them. The contamination has made them who they are. The coma has frozen them where they are. The collective denial has made the truth illegal. Burns has made the alternatives unaffordable. And the audience, the one variable in this system with any genuine freedom of choice, keeps choosing to come back. Not because the show is perfect, not even because it is still as good as it was. Because Springfield is familiar in a way that bypasses critical evaluation entirely. Because the theme song starts and something in the body responds before the mind can weigh in on the question. Because Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie, in their specific dysfunctional constellation, on their specific couch, in their specific house, are part of the emotional landscape of everyone who has watched them long enough to stop noticing that 36 years have passed and they are still exactly where they started. The loop is not their prison. The loop is not even our prison, not exactly. The loop is an invitation, extended every week, to spend a little time in a place that always looks the same, where the family is always intact, where the troubles are always solvable by the end of the hour, where the beer is always cold and the couch is always open and the credits always roll on a world that has survived whatever it just went through and will survive whatever comes next. Close your eyes. Let Springfield settle into its familiar distances. The plant is still running on the hill. The lights are on in every house on Evergreen Terrace. Homer is home. Marge is there. The kids are asleep. Everything is exactly as it was. It always will be. Sleep well. End of script. There is something worth saying about the specific texture of nostalgia that The Simpsons produces, something that distinguishes it from the nostalgia attached to most long-running entertainment properties. Most nostalgia is about a past that is genuinely past. You remember a show from childhood and the feeling attached to it is warm and somewhat melancholy and safely historical because the show ended and the characters aged or died and the world moved on from them even if your feelings have not. The Simpsons does not work this way. The Simpsons never ended. The Simpsons is still running. The characters you remember from childhood are still there, unchanged, doing the same things, occupying the same space. The nostalgia the show produces is a nostalgia for something that has not actually stopped, which creates a feeling that has no clean name but that most long-term viewers will recognize immediately. It is the feeling of watching something that was once part of your present and is now part of your past, while it is simultaneously still in the present. The show did not change and you did. The Simpsons from 1993 is still there in the archive, exactly as it was, and The Simpsons from 2025 is also there, also still running. Both exist simultaneously, and you are older than either of them feels. The family did not age, but you did. The couch is the same couch and you are 30 years older than you were the first time you sat on yours to watch it. This temporal strangeness is part of what makes the floating timeline feel like more than a production convenience. It is producing a genuine emotional effect in the audience that goes beyond entertainment. The show that refuses to let time pass in Springfield is producing, in the audience that watches it, a continuous and never-resolving encounter with the fact that time has passed everywhere else. Every episode is a reminder that something has stayed the same while everything else changed. The show is a mirror that shows you only the parts of reality it has decided to preserve, and everything not reflected in it is everything that has moved on without waiting for the permission of a Sunday night animation. Homer is still stumbling through the door at 5:30. The plant is still on the hill. The family is still on the couch. And you are 30 years older than the last time this all felt new. The show will keep going until it does not, and when it stops, the ending will probably feel both overdue and impossible. Because The Simpsons ending means the permanent present finally admitting it is not permanent. It means Bart turning 11. It means the couch gag running for the last time. It means the credits rolling on a Springfield that has finally, after all this time, agreed to participate in the normal human relationship with time, in which things end and do not come back, and the space they leave is the space they leave, and the only thing to do with that space is carry it forward. We are not there yet. Springfield is still running, the lights are still on, the family is still home. Wherever you are watching this from, whatever time it is where you are, let that be enough for tonight. Let Springfield be what it is. Let the mysteries sit without resolution, because in Springfield, resolution is not really the point. The point is the watching. The point is the return. The point is finding the same town in the same place every time you come back, which is every time you need it to be there. The show will be here when you wake up. It always is. Most people who find videos like this one find them in the same circumstances. Late at night, after the day has officially ended but sleep has not arrived yet, the phone on the pillow or propped against something, the screen, the only light in a dark room, the sound low enough not to disturb anyone else, or headphones in, the world narrowed down to whatever is playing, the specific intimacy of audio that is inside your head rather than filling a room. It is a particular kind of being alone, not the uncomfortable kind, the settled kind, the kind where the day's obligations have all been discharged and the next days have not yet begun, and there is a window of time that belongs entirely to you, in which you are accountable to nothing and nobody and can spend the hours exactly as you choose. These hours tend to produce a certain quality of thinking, something slower and more associative than daytime thinking. The connections between ideas feel more elastic. The space between one thought and the next stretches out rather than snapping to a conclusion. It is the thinking you do when you are almost asleep but not quite, when the cognitive filters are relaxed but consciousness has not fully retreated. This is a state that suits this kind of material well, because the material is about connections and patterns, and the spaces between what a thing says and what a thing means. Springfield was designed to be revisited. The show was built for syndication, for the reruns, for the viewings that happen years after the original broadcast, when the episode is familiar enough that the jokes land with the comfort of recognition rather than the surprise of discovery. The best Simpsons episodes get better with repetition, not because you find new jokes, but because you find the architecture underneath the jokes, the structural choices that produce the emotional effects, the specific moments where the show is saying something it cannot quite say directly and is instead saying it through the accumulation of small true things. The theories exist because some portion of the audience never stopped looking. They kept watching after the original broadcast. They kept watching after the show was declared to have declined. They kept watching in syndication and on streaming and on discs, and through every format that has made the show available across its 36-year run. And in all that watching, they started to see things. Not because the show planted Easter eggs for theorists to find. Because the show was made by people who cared deeply about what they were making and put genuine thought into every element, and genuine thought, applied consistently over a long enough period, produces depths that the surface does not announce. The radiation theory is not in the show as an explicit storyline, but every element required to construct it is in the show, deliberately placed, carefully sustained, available to anyone who looks at the whole thing as a unified body of work, rather than a collection of individual episodes. The coma theory is not confirmed by any episode, but the episode that comes closest to confirming it was produced and animated by the show's own creative team, which tells you something about how seriously the theory was taken by the people who made the show. They made the ending. They just told you it was a joke. The Burns immortality mechanism is not spelled out in any single episode, but it is assembled across dozens of episodes, piece by piece, each piece individually unremarkable, the whole picture becoming visible only when you lay the pieces next to each other and stop treating them as isolated comedy premises. This is what 36 years of careful attention produces. Not a solved mystery, a more interesting mystery. One with more texture and more depth and more genuine connection to things that are true about the world than the surface version suggests. Springfield is a contamination zone where no one can see the contamination. It is a coma dream that keeps running because the dreamer will not let it end. It is a community that has voted to make truth illegal and expels anyone who insists on it. It is a billionaire's life support system scaled to the size of a town. It is a prediction engine that shapes the futures it appears to predict. It is the archive of one family's damage, passed from generation to generation without ever being named. It is all of these things simultaneously. It is also just a show about a yellow family in a yellow town that has been making people laugh for 36 years, and the laughter is real, and the love in it is real, and the specific way it makes certain people feel at home is as real as anything. The two things are not in contradiction. The depth does not cancel the warmth. The darkness does not dissolve the comedy. The theories do not replace the show. They are the show, looked at from a different angle, in better light, after everyone else has gone to sleep. You are still awake. The screen is still on. Springfield is still there. Whatever you find in it tonight, whatever connections your almost sleeping mind assembles from the material, those are yours. The show put them there for you to find whenever you were ready to find them. Go ahead and close your eyes. The stories will keep running without you watching them. That is what stories do. That is what Springfield does. It keeps running. It always keeps running.